There's a special kind of pain that comes from being rejected by the very people who are supposed to love you. Martha Hawkins knew that pain better than anyone in the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Montana. For years, she'd been treated like something to be ashamed of, whispered about behind closed doors, all because her body didn't match what others thought it should be. When her own family decided to sell her off like unwanted property, she believed her life was over. Then Caleb Stone rode into town, a mountain man who saw what no one else could see. What happens when one man's courage changes everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air in Cedar Ridge carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, a crisp reminder that winter was coming to the Montana Territory. Martha Hawkins stepped out of the general store just as the morning sun crested the mountains to the east, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. She carried a basket laden with supplies for Widow Jensen, who lived at the edge of town in a small cabin that needed constant tending. At 28 years old, Martha had become accustomed to making herself useful, to finding purpose in the small acts of service that others overlooked or couldn't be bothered with. She moved through the town with practiced efficiency, her plain brown dress swishing against her ankles, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. Few people greeted her. Those who did offered tight smiles or quick nods before hurrying on their way, as though lingering too long in her presence might somehow taint them. Martha had learned not to take it personally, though the ache of it never quite went away. She'd simply learned to carry it differently, the way one carries an old injury that flares up in cold weather. The general store where she worked most days was owned by Silas Garrett, a weathered man in his 60s who'd lost his wife to consumption 3 years prior. He was one of the few people in Cedar Ridge who treated Martha with genuine kindness, who saw past the surface to the person beneath. Inside his store, a worn ledger sat on the counter, its pages filled with careful notations in Martha's neat handwriting. Those pages told a story that most folks in town preferred to ignore, a record of every favor Martha had done, every debt she'd quietly forgiven, every time she'd extended credit to families who couldn't quite make ends meet. Mr. Garrett often said that Martha had a better head for numbers than anyone he'd ever known, and a better heart than the whole town put together. But saying such things aloud in mixed company would have raised eyebrows. So he kept his observations mostly to himself, shared only in the quiet moments when it was just the two of them, tallying the week's receipts. Martha had been born in Cedar Ridge, the only child of Jacob and Caroline Hawkins. Her mother had been a gentlewoman with kind eyes and a gift for making people feel seen. Caroline had run a small bakery out of their home, and the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls had been the backdrop of Martha's childhood. Those had been happy years, filled with laughter and warmth, with a mother who sang while she worked and a father who told stories by the fire at night. But Caroline had died when Martha was 14, taken by a fever that swept through town one particularly harsh winter. Jacob had been lost without his wife, wandering through the days like a man in a fog. Within a year, he'd remarried. A practical decision, he'd said, because a man needed a wife and a young girl needed a mother. Eleanor Pritchard had seemed like a reasonable choice. She was a widow herself, with a daughter named Penelope, who was 2 years younger than Martha. The arrangement had made sense on paper. In reality, it had been the beginning of Martha's slow exile from the only home she'd ever known. Eleanor was not a warm woman. She was sharp-edged and status-conscious, the kind of person who measured worth in social standing and physical appearance. She'd taken one look at Martha, already showing the fuller figure that would only become more pronounced as she grew, and made her judgment. In Eleanor's world, there were people who mattered and people who didn't, and Martha clearly fell into the latter category. The transformation had been gradual but inexorable. First, Martha was moved from her childhood bedroom to a smaller room at the back of the house. Then her mother's things were packed away, the bakery closed, the warmth and smell of fresh bread replaced by Eleanor's insistence on propriety and appearances. Martha's clothes became plainer, her portions at dinner smaller, her presence at social gatherings discouraged. Eleanor had a way of making her feelings known without ever saying anything directly cruel. A raised eyebrow here, a dismissive gesture there, a conversation that stopped when Martha entered the room. Penelope, by contrast, was everything Eleanor valued. Petite, pretty, with delicate features and a wardrobe that consumed most of the household budget. She'd learned her mother's lessons well, treating Martha with the same casual disdain one might show a servant. Not openly hostile, just perpetually indifferent, as though Martha were a piece of furniture that happened to be in the way. Jacob had watched all of this happen and done nothing. That was perhaps the deepest cut of all. Martha understood that grief had hollowed him out, that Eleanor's forceful personality had filled the void her mother left behind. But understanding didn't ease the pain of watching her father turn away, of seeing him choose peace over protecting his own daughter. He'd become a shadow in his own house, speaking only when spoken to, avoiding Martha's eyes when Eleanor made one of her pointed comments. So Martha had learned to make herself small, to find value in being useful rather than loved. She'd taken work at the general store, caring for Widow Jensen, helping at the church, mending clothes for families who couldn't afford the seamstress's rates. She'd become the person people called on when they needed something but didn't want to owe a real favor. She was reliable, forgettable, and thoroughly taken for granted. The town itself was typical of Montana Territory in 1882, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a main street, with homes spreading out in rough circles from the center. There was a church, a saloon, a blacksmith, the general store, and a handful of other establishments that served the ranchers and farmers who worked the surrounding land. The mountains loomed in every direction, beautiful and unforgiving, a reminder that civilization here was a tenuous thing, always just one harsh winter away from collapse. Cedar Ridge had its hierarchies like any town. The banker and the lawyer were at the top, followed by the more successful ranchers and merchants. Then came the working folks, the blacksmith, the storekeepers, the farmers with smaller holdings. At the bottom were people like Martha, who had no real place in the social order except as convenient help when needed. The gossip in Cedar Ridge was relentless and cruel. Martha had heard the whispers her whole adult life, how she'd never marry because no man would have her, how it was a shame about her size, especially since her mother had been such a handsome woman. How her father must be disappointed to have ended up with a daughter like that. The words were arrows, and they found their mark every time. No matter how much armor Martha tried to build around her heart, but there were small mercies scattered throughout her days. Mr. Garrett's quiet kindness was one. Widow Jensen's grateful smile when Martha brought her groceries and stayed to share tea was another. The church organist, Mrs. Patterson, always made a point to compliment Martha's singing voice during hymns. These moments didn't erase the loneliness, but they made it bearable. Martha had long ago given up on the idea of marriage or children, of having a home that was truly her own. Those dreams belonged to girls like Penelope, who'd recently gotten engaged to the banker's son in what Eleanor considered a tremendous social coup. The wedding was planned for late October, and the house had been in an uproar of preparations for months. Martha had been drafted to help with sewing, cleaning, and organizing, always in the background, never acknowledged, except when there was work to be done. She told herself she didn't mind. She told herself she'd found a kind of peace in accepting her lot. But late at night, in her small room at the back of her father's house, she sometimes allowed herself to imagine a different life, a life where someone looked at her the way her father had once looked at her mother, with genuine love and respect. A life where she wasn't always apologizing for taking up space in the world. On this particular autumn morning, as Martha made her way to Widow Jensen's cabin, she had no idea that her entire world was about to shift on its axis. She didn't know that her stepmother had been planning something unspeakable, or that a stranger would ride into town and see her in a way no one else ever had. She only knew that her basket was heavy, her feet were tired, and she had a full day of work ahead of her. Widow Jensen was delighted to see her as always. The old woman's face lit up when Martha knocked on her door, ushering her inside with trembling hands. The cabin was small but tidy, smelling of lavender and old wood. They sat together at the kitchen table, and Martha unpacked the supplies she'd brought: flour, sugar, tea, a tin of peaches that Mr. Garrett had set aside specially. "You're too good to me, child," Widow Jensen said, her voice wavering with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "Nonsense," Martha replied, pouring tea into chipped porcelain cups. "You'd manage just fine. Besides, you're doing me a favor. It's nice to have someone to talk to." And it was true. Here in this small cabin, Martha could relax in a way she never could at home. Widow Jensen asked about her day, listened to her answers, treated her like a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. They talked about simple things: the weather, the upcoming winter, a recipe for preserves. But underneath the ordinary conversation was a deeper current of genuine affection and respect. When Martha finally left the widow's cabin, the sun was high overhead. She needed to get back to the store to help Mr. Garrett with the afternoon deliveries. But as she walked back toward town, she noticed an unusual number of people gathered near the saloon, talking in low, excited voices. Something was happening, though she couldn't make out what from this distance. She quickened her pace, curiosity overcoming her usual caution about drawing attention to herself. As she drew closer, she could hear fragments of conversation, something about strangers in town, about land deals, about changes coming to Cedar Ridge. The words made her uneasy, though she couldn't say exactly why. Change, in her experience, rarely brought anything good for people like her. Mr. Garrett was standing in the doorway of the general store, his weathered face creased with concern. When he saw Martha approaching, he motioned her inside quickly, closing the door behind them. "What's going on?" she asked, setting down her empty basket. "Trouble, I suspect," he said quietly. "Eleanor Hawkins was in here this morning, asking questions about traveling merchants and legal documents. Had that look about her, the one she gets when she's scheming something." Martha felt a chill run down her spine. Eleanor's schemes never boded well for her. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that made me nervous," Mr. Garrett said. "I think you should be careful, Martha. Watch your step around that woman." But it was already too late for caution. The wheels had been set in motion, and Martha's life as she knew it was about to come crashing down around her. Eleanor had made her decision, and nothing, not propriety, not decency, not even basic human compassion, was going to stand in her way. The afternoon passed in uneasy anticipation. Martha worked through her usual tasks, but her mind kept circling back to Mr. Garrett's warning. When the sun began its descent toward the mountains and it was time to head home for supper, she found herself walking more slowly than usual, dreading what might be waiting for her. The Hawkins house sat on a side street, a respectable two-story structure that Eleanor kept meticulously maintained. Martha let herself in through the back door, as she always did, hanging her shawl on the peg and washing her hands at the basin. She could hear voices from the dining room, Eleanor's sharp tones, Penelope's lighter responses, and her father's occasional murmur. When she entered the dining room, 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Eleanor's were cold and calculating. Penelope's were indifferent. Her father's were averted, unable to meet her gaze. Martha's stomach dropped. She knew that configuration of expressions. Something bad was about to happen. "Sit down, Martha," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We have important family matters to discuss." Martha sat, her hands folded in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs. Whatever was coming, she would face it with as much dignity as she could muster. It was all she had left. Eleanor didn't waste time with pleasantries. She reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a folded piece of paper, placing it on the table with deliberate precision. The document looked official, with heavy script and what appeared to be legal language printed across the top. "Martha," Eleanor began, smoothing the paper with her fingers, "your father and I have been discussing your future. You're 28 years old now. And it's become quite clear that you have no prospects here in Cedar Ridge. No respectable man is going to offer for you, and frankly, maintaining you in this household has become a burden we can no longer sustain." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at her father, silently pleading for him to intervene, to say something, to defend her. But Jacob Hawkins sat frozen in his chair, his eyes fixed on his plate, his jaw working as though chewing words he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. "What are you saying?" Martha managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying we found a solution that benefits everyone involved," Eleanor continued, her tone brisk and businesslike. "A merchant named Augustus Drummond passes through Cedar Ridge twice a year on his trading route. He's a widower, getting on in years, and he needs someone to manage his household while he travels. Cook, clean, mend his clothes, that sort of thing. He's agreed to take you on." "Take me on?" Martha repeated, confusion mixing with growing dread. "You mean as a housekeeper?" "Of sorts." Eleanor's smile was thin and cold. "Mr. Drummond will pay us a sum for your services. Call it compensation for the years we've fed and housed you. In return, he'll provide you with room and board. It's more than generous, considering the circumstances." The words hit Martha like physical blows. "You're selling me? Like property?" "Don't be dramatic," Eleanor snapped. "We're arranging a practical solution to a difficult situation. You should be grateful we've found anyone willing to take you at all." "Papa." Martha turned to her father, her voice breaking. "Papa, please." "You can't allow this." Jacob Hawkins finally looked up, and what Martha saw in his face shattered something deep inside her. There was guilt there, yes, and shame, but also resignation. He'd already made his choice, and it wasn't her. "Eleanor's right," he said quietly. "It's a practical arrangement. You'll have a roof over your head and food to eat. That's more than many folks can say. I have that here." Martha's voice rose despite her best efforts to control it. "I work for Mr. Garrett. I help Widow Jensen. I contribute to this household. I'm not a burden. I earn my keep." "Your wages barely cover your food," Eleanor interjected. "And with Penelope's wedding approaching, we need the space. Your room will make an excellent nursery once she and Thomas start their family. Everything's been arranged. Mr. Drummond arrives tomorrow to collect you." The casualness of it was almost worse than the act itself. Eleanor spoke as though discussing the sale of an old piece of furniture, something that had outlived its usefulness and needed to be cleared out. Penelope sat silent through the entire exchange, examining her fingernails with studied disinterest. "This is wrong," Martha said, her voice shaking. It's inhuman. I'm a person, not goods to be traded. You're an unmarried woman with no prospects and no means of supporting yourself," Eleanor replied coldly. "Be realistic, Martha. This is the best offer you're likely to receive. Mr. Drummond may not be young or handsome, but he's willing to provide for you. That's more consideration than you deserve, given the embarrassment you've caused this family." Embarrassment. The word came out strangled. "What have I ever done to embarrass anyone?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Your very existence is an embarrassment. Do you think people don't talk? Do you think they don't whisper about poor Jacob Hawkins, saddled with a daughter like you? Every time we attend a social function, every time someone sees you shuffling through town, it reflects poorly on this family. Penelope's prospects would have been even better if not for the association with you." The cruelty was breathtaking in its honesty. At least Eleanor wasn't pretending anymore, wasn't hiding behind false propriety. This was the truth Martha had always suspected, but never heard spoken aloud. She was unwanted, unwelcome, a blight on the family name. "When does he arrive?" Martha asked quietly, all fight draining out of her. "Tomorrow afternoon," Eleanor said with satisfaction. "You'll have tonight to pack your things." "Not that you have much to pack." Martha stood on shaking legs. She looked one more time at her father, giving him a final chance to find his spine, to remember the daughter he'd once loved. But Jacob kept his eyes down, a coward to the bitter end. "May I be excused?" Martha asked, her voice hollow. Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "Go, and don't make a scene tomorrow. Accept this with whatever dignity you can manage." Martha walked to her small room at the back of the house, each step feeling like she was moving through deep water. She closed the door behind her and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the bare walls that had been her prison for so many years. The only item of real value she owned was a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother, containing a faded photograph of Martha as a child, smiling and happy, before the world had taught her to be ashamed of herself. She opened the locket now, looking at that little girl's face. What would her mother think if she could see what had become of her daughter? Would Caroline be disappointed that Martha hadn't fought harder, hadn't found a way to escape this fate? Or would she understand that some battles couldn't be won, that survival sometimes meant surrendering? Sleep didn't come that night. Martha lay awake, listening to the house settle around her, trying to imagine what her new life would be like. Augustus Drummond, she'd seen him once or twice on his trading trips through town. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, with greedy eyes and a way of looking at women that made her skin crawl. The thought of being alone with him, dependent on him, trapped in his household with no escape, filled her with dread so profound it was almost paralyzing. She considered running. She had a little money saved, coins hidden in a tin under a loose floorboard. But where would she go? A woman alone in the Montana Territory wouldn't last long, and she had no family elsewhere, no friends who could take her in. The mountains were beautiful but deadly, especially with winter coming. She'd freeze or starve before she made it to the next town. Morning came grey and cold. Martha packed her few belongings in a small carpet bag. A change of clothes, her mother's locket, a worn Bible, the little tin of savings. Everything she owned in the world fit into one small bag. The thought should have been freeing, but instead it just felt sad. She didn't go down for breakfast. She couldn't stomach the thought of sitting at that table again, pretending everything was normal. Instead, she slipped out early and walked to the general store, needing to tell Mr. Garrett what was happening before he heard it from someone else. He was opening up when she arrived, and one look at her face told him something was terribly wrong. She explained the situation in halting sentences, watching his weathered face darken with anger. "That woman is a devil," he said when she finished. "And your father is a fool and a coward for allowing it. You can't go with Drummond, Martha. The man's a snake. I've dealt with him. He cheats on his trades and treats people like dirt. I don't have a choice," Martha said quietly. "If I refuse, where will I go? What will I do?" Mr. Garrett opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, the helplessness evident in his eyes. They both knew the truth. In 1882, Montana, an unmarried woman without family support, had almost no options. The world was not kind to women in Martha's position. "At least let me come this afternoon," he said finally. "As a witness, make sure everything's done proper and legal. For whatever that's worth." Martha nodded gratefully. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The afternoon arrived too quickly. Martha stood in the parlor of her father's house, her carpetbag at her feet, waiting for her fate to arrive. Eleanor had insisted she wear her plainest dress, had even criticized the way she'd done her hair, as though Martha's appearance might somehow affect the transaction. Penelope was conspicuously absent, hiding upstairs to avoid witnessing the ugliness directly. When Augustus Drummond arrived, he didn't come alone. He brought a witness of his own, a thin, nervous man who introduced himself as Mr. Guthrie, Drummond's business associate. Drummond himself was exactly as Martha remembered, thick around the middle, with thinning hair and small eyes that assessed her like livestock at auction. "Well, well," he said, circling her slowly. "She's a big one, isn't she? But that's fine. Means she can handle heavy work. Good strong back for carrying and cleaning." Martha felt her face burn with humiliation. Eleanor's smile was triumphant, pleased to be rid of her burden. Jacob stood in the corner, still unable to meet his daughter's eyes. Mr. Garrett arrived just as Drummond was pulling out the contract, the actual bill of sale that would transfer Martha from her family to him. The document was horrifying in its clinical language, reducing a human life to terms and conditions, payment and goods received. "This is madness," Mr. Garrett said, his voice tight with anger. "You can't sell a person like a horse or a plot of land." "It's perfectly legal," Drummond replied smoothly. "She's entering my employment of her own free will, and her family is being compensated for the training and upbringing they've provided. Everything above board. Of her own free will?" Mr. Garrett turned to Martha. "Is that true? Are you choosing this?" Martha looked around the room, at Eleanor's cold satisfaction, at her father's cowardice, at Drummond's greedy anticipation. What choice did she have? Where else could she go? She began, but the words stuck in her throat. That's when they heard it, the sound of a horse outside, heavy hoofbeats stopping in front of the house. Everyone turned toward the door as it opened without preamble, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His clothes were simple but well-made, his face partially hidden by a thick beard, but his eyes were clear and sharp, taking in the scene with quick intelligence. "Heard there was business being conducted here," the stranger said, his voice deep and measured. "Thought I might take a look at the merchandise before any deals get finalized." Drummond's face registered surprise and then annoyance. "This is a private matter." "Who the hell are you?" "Name's Caleb Stone," the man replied, those sharp eyes moving to Martha and staying there. "And if you're selling, I might be buying. Seems only fair to let a lady have more than one option." The room went very still. Martha found herself unable to look away from this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere, whose presence had somehow changed the entire atmosphere of the transaction. For the first time since this nightmare began, a small flicker of something that might have been hope sparked in her. Just everything was about to change. Caleb Stone stood in the doorway with the calm assurance of a man who knew exactly what he was worth and didn't need anyone else's validation. Martha had seen men like him before, mountain men who came down from the high country once or twice a year to trade furs and restock supplies. They were a different breed from the townsmen of Cedar Ridge, hardened by isolation and the elements, answerable only to themselves and the harsh demands of wilderness survival. But there was something else in this man's bearing, something that set him apart even from other mountain men. He carried himself with quiet authority, his movements economical and purposeful. At his belt hung a hunting knife in a worn leather sheath, the handle carved with intricate patterns that spoke of long, solitary evenings and skilled hands. That knife had clearly seen years of use, skinning game, cutting rope, preparing firewood, defending against whatever dangers the mountains held. It was a tool, but also a symbol of the self-reliant life he'd built, far from so-called civilization. "I don't know what you think you heard," Eleanor said sharply, recovering from her surprise, "but this is a family matter. We don't need interference from strangers." Caleb's gaze shifted to her, cool and assessing. "Funny thing about family matters, when they're being conducted in the middle of town with legal witnesses, they stop being quite so private. Word travels fast in a place like Cedar Ridge." He was right. Martha realized that several townspeople had gathered outside, drawn by the unusual sight of the mountain man's arrival. News of what was happening had already spread through town like wildfire, though no one had cared enough to intervene. They were just curious spectators to her humiliation. Drummond stepped forward, puffing himself up. "Now see here, I've already negotiated terms with the lady's family. You can't just waltz in and—" "Can't I?" Caleb interrupted quietly. "Last I checked, we're in America. Free market and all that. If you're buying, and I'm interested in buying the same commodity, seems like the seller gets to choose who offers the better terms." Martha felt her face burn at being called a commodity, but she understood the strategy. Caleb was speaking Eleanor's language, turning her own logic against her. If Martha was property to be sold, then basic economics applied. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, calculating. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Stone?" "Simple enough," Caleb replied. "I'll pay double whatever Drummond's offering. Cash right now. And I'll take the lady off your hands today, save you the trouble of housing her another night." The room went silent. Drummond's face flushed with anger and indignation. "This is outrageous. We had an agreement." "That being the operative word," Caleb said mildly. Until papers are signed, everything's still negotiable. Isn't that right, Mrs. Hawkins? Eleanor's mind was clearly working through the mathematics. Double the payment was substantial, enough to fund Penelope's entire wedding, and then some. Her greedy nature warred briefly with her distrust of the unexpected, but greed won out. It always did with Eleanor. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Stone," she said slowly. "Though I'd need to see proof you have the funds." Without a word, Caleb reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. He loosened the drawstring and poured a stream of gold coins onto the side table. Not paper money, but actual gold. The coins gleamed in the afternoon light, more money than most people in Cedar Ridge saw in a year. Eleanor's eyes widened with undisguised avarice. "That should cover it," Caleb said. "With some extra for your trouble." Drummond sputtered protests, but everyone in the room knew the deal was done. Eleanor was already reaching for the coins, her fingers trembling slightly. "Mr. Drummond, I'm sorry, but as Mr. Stone pointed out, business is business. I'm sure you understand." Drummond's face went from red to purple. "This is highway robbery. You gave me your word, and now I'm giving you my regrets," Eleanor said coldly. "Good day, Mr. Drummond." The merchant stormed out, his associate Guthrie scurrying after him. Mr. Garrett watched the whole exchange with a mixture of relief and concern, clearly trying to determine if Martha had just been rescued or simply sold to a different buyer. Caleb turned to Martha for the first time, really looking at her. His eyes were grey, she noticed, like storm clouds over the mountains. They held something she hadn't expected: respect. Not pity, not desire, not the cruel assessment Drummond had given her. Just simple, genuine respect for another human being. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I know this is all happening fast, and I know you don't know me from Adam. But I want to make one thing very clear. I didn't buy you. I can't buy a person, and I wouldn't if I could. What I did was pay off a debt your family claimed you owed them. That debt is now settled. You don't owe me anything." Martha stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "I don't understand." "It's simple enough," Caleb continued. "You're free to go wherever you want. I've got a cabin about 15 miles northeast of here, up in the high country. If you want to come there, you're welcome. If you'd rather I take you to the next town over or to family elsewhere, I'll do that too. If you want to stay here in Cedar Ridge and work for Mr. Garrett or set up on your own, that's your right. The choice is yours, and yours alone." Eleanor made a sound of protest. "Now wait just a moment. The transaction's complete," Caleb said, his voice hardening slightly as he looked at her. "You got your money. You don't get to dictate what happens next. That's between me and the lady." He turned back to Martha, his expression gentling. "I know this is a lot to take in. You don't have to decide right this second. But I will tell you this. I could use someone at my cabin who knows how to run a household. I'm good at living off the land, but I'm not much for cooking or keeping a place organized. I'd be willing to offer you room, board, and fair wages for that kind of help. It would be a business arrangement, respectful and above board. You'd have your own space, your own privacy, and the freedom to leave any time you wanted. That's my offer. You can take it or leave it. No hard feelings either way." Martha felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here, not in front of Eleanor." She looked at Mr. Garrett, silently asking for his advice. The old storekeeper studied Caleb Stone with the careful eye of someone who dealt with men of all types for 40 years. "You'll treat her right?" Mr. Garrett asked bluntly. "Your word on that?" "You have my word," Caleb replied without hesitation. "I lost my wife 6 years back. Died of fever, same as a lot of folks out here. I know what it's like to be alone, to feel like the world's moved on without you. I wouldn't add to anyone else's suffering, least of all a woman who's clearly already had more than her share of hard times." There was truth in his words. Martha could feel it. And more than that, there was something in his face when he mentioned his late wife, a flash of old grief that told her he understood loss in a way most people didn't. She had 3 choices, as she saw it. She could stay in Cedar Ridge, try to make it on her own, with the few coins she'd saved and whatever work she could find. But Eleanor would make that impossible, turning the town against her even more than they already were. She could ask Caleb to take her to another town, show up as a stranger with nothing and no one, trying to build a life from scratch in an unfamiliar place. Or she could take a chance on this mountain man who'd appeared out of nowhere and offered her something no one else ever had: respect and choice. "I'll come with you," Martha said quietly. "To your cabin. I'd like to see it at least, before I decide anything more permanent." Caleb nodded, accepting her decision without triumph or presumption. "That's fair. Get your things and we'll head out. Still have a few hours of good daylight left." Martha picked up her carpet bag, still packed from this morning, still containing everything she owned in the world. She looked one last time at her father, hoping even now for some word of regret or love. But Jacob Hawkins just stood there, counting Eleanor's gold coins, having sold his daughter's freedom for metal that would tarnish. "Goodbye, Papa," Martha said softly. He flinched, but didn't answer. Eleanor was already planning how to spend the windfall, her mind moving past Martha as though she'd never existed. Only Mr. Garrett followed them out, walking with Martha to where Caleb's horse waited, a sturdy roan mare with intelligent eyes and a patient disposition. "You send word if you need anything," Mr. Garrett said, gripping Martha's hand. "Anything at all, you hear me? I'll come running." "Thank you," Martha whispered, embracing him quickly. "For everything. For being kind when no one else was. You're a good person, Martha Hawkins," he said gruffly. "Don't let anyone ever tell you different." Caleb secured her carpet bag to his saddle, then turned to Martha with an expectant look. It took her a moment to realize what he was waiting for: permission to help her mount. Even in this small thing, he was giving her agency, not presuming. She nodded, and he lifted her onto the horse with an ease that spoke of considerable strength. He weighed nothing to him, though she'd been made to feel heavy and burdensome her entire adult life. He swung up behind her, careful to maintain respectful distance, and clicked softly to the mare. As they rode out of Cedar Ridge, Martha didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. Ahead lay the mountains, vast and unknowable, and a future that was terrifying precisely because it was unwritten. For the first time in 14 years, she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in just as long, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than dread. They rode in silence for the first hour, following a trail that climbed steadily into the foothills. The air grew cooler and thinner, scented with pine and the approaching bite of winter. Martha had never been this far from town, had never seen the wilderness from this perspective. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Endless forests, distant peaks touched with early snow, valleys filled with golden aspens that trembled in the breeze. "You doing all right?" Caleb asked after a while, his voice low and measured. "Yes," Martha answered, surprised to find it was mostly true. "It's beautiful up here." "That it is," he agreed. "Hard living sometimes, especially in deep winter, but beautiful and quiet. I've always preferred the company of mountains to the company of most people." "I can understand that," Martha said quietly. They rode on, the rhythmic movement of the horse oddly soothing. Martha found herself relaxing slightly, though she remained wary. She still didn't really know this man, didn't understand why he'd intervened on her behalf. Men didn't do things without reason, and she'd learned to be suspicious of seemingly altruistic gestures. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb spoke again. "I expect you're wondering why I showed up when I did." "The thought had crossed my mind," Martha admitted. "Fair question. Truth is, I was in town selling some furs when I overheard folks talking about what your stepmother was planning. Didn't sit right with me. The whole notion of selling off a person like they were property reminded me too much of ugliness I've seen before, things that shouldn't happen in a country that calls itself free." He paused, then continued. "I also heard Mr. Garrett defending you, saying what kind of person you really are. That man doesn't suffer fools, and he doesn't praise lightly. If he vouches for someone, that carries weight with me." Martha absorbed this, a small warmth spreading through her chest at the knowledge that Mr. Garrett had spoken up for her, even when she wasn't there to hear it. "I want you to know something," Caleb said, his tone becoming more serious. "When we get to my cabin, You'll have a room of your own with a proper door that locks from the inside. I'm offering you work and shelter, nothing more. I'm not looking to take advantage, and I'm not expecting anything beyond honest labor for honest pay. You can trust that or not, time will tell either way. But I wanted to say it plain so there's no misunderstanding. Why? Martha asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Why would you do all this for a stranger? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. Because 6 years ago, my Sarah died, and the town we lived near didn't lift a finger to help. Folks saw she was sick, so I was struggling to care for her and keep the homestead running, and they just looked the other way. Too busy, too uncomfortable, too convinced it wasn't their problem. She died alone while I was out hunting for food, and I've carried that with me every day since. He cleared his throat. I can't change what happened to her, but I can make sure I'm not the kind of man who sees someone in need and walks past. That's not who I want to be. So when I heard what was happening to you, I decided I was going to do something about it. Simple as that. Martha felt tears slip down her cheeks, but this time she didn't fight them. Here in the wilderness with this strange, honorable man, she finally felt safe enough to cry. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Caleb's cabin came into view. It sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small stream running nearby and the mountains rising dramatically beyond. The cabin itself was solidly built from hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that faced the valley below. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting Caleb had banked the fire before leaving that morning. It's not fancy, Caleb said as they approached, but it's sturdy. Keeps out the wind and the cold, which matters more than looks up here. Martha slid down from the horse, her legs stiff from the long ride. She looked around the clearing, taking in the neatly stacked woodpile, the small barn for the horse, the well-maintained garden plot that had been put to bed for winter. Everything spoke of careful attention and pride of workmanship. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a home, built by a man who valued quality and permanence. Caleb led the horse to the barn, unsaddling her with practiced efficiency. Martha followed, watching as he brushed the mare down and gave her fresh water and hay. The barn was as tidy as everything else. Tools hung in their proper places, tack well-oiled and cared for. "This is Rosie," Caleb said, patting the mare's neck. "Best trail horse I've ever had. Smart enough to find her way home in a snowstorm and gentle enough to trust with precious cargo." He glanced at Martha when he said that last part, and she realized he was talking about her. The thought made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. They walked to the cabin together. Caleb opened the door and stepped aside, letting Martha enter first. The interior was larger than it had seemed from outside. One main room that served as kitchen and living area, with two smaller rooms branching off. A fire burned low in the stone fireplace, warming the space. The furniture was simple but well crafted. A table and chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, shelves lined with books and supplies. Everything was clean and organized in a way that surprised her. She'd expected bachelor chaos, but this was the home of a man who valued order. "That door on the left is where I sleep," Caleb said, pointing. "The one on the right would be yours. It's smaller, but it's got a good bed and a window that looks east toward the sunrise. Door has a bolt on the inside, like I mentioned. You can lock it any time you want, and I won't take offense." He crossed to the other door and opened it, gesturing for Martha to look inside. The room was indeed smaller than the main one, but it was far from cramped. A narrow bed with a thick quilt dominated one wall, and there was a small dresser, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a chair near the window. The window itself had real glass, a luxury in these parts, and curtains that could be drawn for privacy. But what caught Martha's attention was the quilt on the bed. She moved closer, running her fingers over the intricate pattern of fabrics, each patch carefully chosen and stitched with obvious skill and care. The work was beautiful, the colors warm and inviting, the stitches small and even. This wasn't a hastily thrown-together coverlet. This was art created with patience and love. "Did your wife make this?" Martha asked softly. "She did," Caleb replied from the doorway. Sarah was a fine seamstress. Made that quilt the first winter we were married, when snow kept us inside for days on end. Said every patch held a memory, pieces of her wedding dress, my mother's apron, fabric from the journey west. I couldn't bring myself to pack it away after she passed. Seemed wrong somehow, like hiding away all those memories. Martha understood completely. She thought of her mother's locket, the only tangible connection she had to happier times. It's beautiful. I'll take good care of it. I know you will, Caleb said simply. Then with characteristic directness he added, I should lay out what I'm proposing so you can make an informed decision about staying or going. They moved back to the main room. Caleb gestured for Martha to sit in the rocking chair, the most comfortable seat, while he pulled up one of the straight-back chairs from the table. He sat facing her, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his expression serious but open. Here's what I can offer, he began. Room and board, obviously. You'd have that room we just looked at, all your meals, and I'd supply whatever clothes or personal items you need. In terms of work, I'd ask you to handle the cooking, keeping the cabin clean, mending clothes when they need it, and helping with preserving food for winter. During growing season, there'd be garden work, but I'd help with the heavy lifting. He paused, making sure she was following. In return, I'd pay you actual wages, not a lot, but fair for the work. Money you could save up if you decided you wanted to head to a city eventually, or use however you see fit. It's your earnings, not mine. That's more than generous, Martha said quietly. It's fair, Caleb corrected. There's a difference. But here's the important part. This would be a business arrangement between equals. Not master and servant, not husband and wife, just two people helping each other survive and maybe make life a little easier for both. I'm not looking for a replacement for Sarah. That wouldn't be fair to you or to her memory. I'm looking for a partner in keeping this homestead running. He met her eyes directly. Now, I won't lie to you. Living up here is isolated. Winters are hard. We might go weeks without seeing another soul. The nearest neighbor is the Anderson family, about 5 miles east. Good people, and Mrs. Anderson would be happy for female company, I suspect. We make a trip to Cedar Ridge maybe once a month for supplies and to trade furs. Otherwise, it's just this, the cabin, the mountains, and whatever conversation we can manage between us. What about— Martha hesitated, then forced herself to continue. What about marriage? If people hear I'm living up here with you, they'll talk. They'll assume things. People always assume things, Caleb said with a slight shrug. Can't control that. But if it matters to you what they think, then yes, we could get married. Make it legal and proper in the eyes of the law. The circuit preacher comes through these parts every few months. We could wait for him, have a simple ceremony, and then you'd have the protection of my name and legal standing as my wife. He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. But I want you to understand, if we did that, I wouldn't expect it to be a real marriage in the usual sense. Not unless and until you decided you wanted it to be. You'd still have your own room, your own space, your own choices. Marriage would just be a piece of paper to make things easier in terms of how the world sees you. Nothing would change about the respect I show you or the boundaries I keep. Martha absorbed all of this, her mind whirling. It was so much to take in, more kindness and consideration than she'd experienced in years. Part of her waited for the catch, for the moment when Caleb would reveal his true intentions. But another part, the part that had always been good at reading people, told her he meant every word. Can I ask you something? She said. Anything. Why didn't you remarry after your wife died? 6 years is a long time to be alone. Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. I thought about it, he finally said. First year after Sarah passed, folks tried to match me up with various women. Widows mostly, or daughters of ranchers looking for a husband. But none of it felt right. They were looking at me as a solution to their problems, a husband to provide for them, a man to give them status or security. And I was looking at them the same way, trying to fill a hole in my life. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the mountains. Realized after a while that I was better off alone than settling for something that wasn't real. I made peace with the solitude, built this life on my own terms, And I figured if the right person came along, I'd know it. If not, well, I had the mountains and my work and my memories. That was enough. He turned back to face her. I'm not saying you're that right person. We barely know each other. But when I saw what was happening to you today, when I heard how you've been treated, something in me recognized something in you. Another person who knows what it's like to be undervalued, to have people look right through you like you don't matter. I thought maybe we could help each other. That's all this is. Martha felt something shift inside her chest, like a door she'd kept locked for years was finally creaking open. What if I want to stay? She asked quietly. Not forever necessarily, but for now. To see how it works, then you stay, Caleb said simply. For as long as it suits you. And if it stops suiting you, you leave. No hard feelings, no obligations, and the marriage. He considered. Your choice entirely. If you want the protection of it, we can arrange it when the preacher comes through. If you'd rather wait and see how things go first, that's fine too. I'm in no hurry, and neither should you be. This is your life, Martha. You get to decide how you want to live it. It was such a foreign concept, being given choice, being treated as though her preferences mattered. Martha felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. I'd like to stay, she said. For now. And maybe we could talk about marriage later if things work out. I just need time to adjust to all of this. Time you've got, Caleb said with a small smile. We've got nothing but time up here. He moved to the kitchen area, pulling out supplies. You must be hungry. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage some basic things. Or if you're tired, you could rest and I'll bring you something when it's ready. Martha stood, smoothing her skirt. I'd rather help if that's all right. I'd like to start earning my keep. You don't owe me anything, Caleb reminded her gently. But if you want to help, I won't say no. Truth is, I've been eating my own cooking for 6 years, and I'm thoroughly sick of it. They worked together to prepare a simple meal, venison stew from meat Caleb had preserved, biscuits that Martha mixed and shaped with practiced hands, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. As they worked, they talked in fits and starts, learning the basics about each other. Martha learned that Caleb was 36, that he'd come west from Pennsylvania after the war, that he'd met Sarah at a church social and known within 5 minutes he wanted to marry her. Caleb learned that Martha loved to read, but rarely had access to books, that her mother had taught her to bake and sew, that she had a good head for numbers, and had once dreamed of becoming a teacher before life convinced her such dreams were foolish. Not foolish, Caleb said, ladling stew into bowls. Deferred, maybe, but not foolish. You're still young enough to do whatever you set your mind to. Martha almost laughed at that. I'm 28. Practically an old maid. Sarah was 29 when she died, Caleb said quietly. I'd give anything for her to have had more time, more chances to do the things she wanted. Don't waste your years thinking they're already behind you, Martha. That's giving up, and you don't strike me as someone who gives up. They ate in companionable silence, the stew warming Martha from the inside out. It was simple food, but it tasted better than anything she could remember eating in recent years, probably because it was seasoned with kindness and offered without condition. After dinner, Caleb showed her where everything was kept, the root cellar where preserved foods were stored, the smokehouse where meat hung, the well where water was drawn. He explained the routine of mountain living, how to read the weather, how to watch for signs of early winter, how to stay safe if she ventured outside the clearing. I'll be gone sometimes, he said, checking trap lines, hunting, occasionally trading with other mountain men, but never for more than a few days, and never without making sure you have everything you need. If there's ever an emergency, the Andersons are due east. Just follow the stream until you hit the wider creek, then follow that north. Their place is marked with a red flag on the barn. Martha nodded, committing it all to memory. She was tired, bone-tired in a way that went beyond the physical journey. The emotional weight of the day was finally catching up with her. Caleb seemed to notice. You should rest. It's been a long day, and you've been through more than most folks could handle. Take whatever time you need to settle in. Martha retreated to her small room, closing the door behind her and sliding the bolt home. The metallic click was satisfying, a small assertion of control over her own space. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over Sarah's quilt again. Each patch was a story, a memory stitched into fabric, a whole life, preserved in cloth and thread. She thought about her mother's locket, still tucked safely in her carpetbag. She retrieved it now, opening it to look at the faded photograph of her younger self. That little girl had been so happy, so certain of being loved. What would she think of the woman Martha had become? Would she be disappointed in how passive she'd been? How long she'd endured cruelty without fighting back? Or would she be proud that Martha had survived, that she'd kept her kindness intact despite every reason to become bitter and hard? Martha didn't have answers to these questions, but lying here in this small, safe room, listening to the gentle sounds of Caleb moving around in the main cabin, she felt something she hadn't felt in 14 years. Hope. Fragile and tentative, but real. She changed into her nightgown, washed her face in the basin and climbed into bed. The quilt was warm and smelled faintly of pine and clean mountain air. Through the window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more stars than she'd ever seen from town. The vastness of it should have been frightening, but instead it felt liberating. She was miles from Cedar Ridge, from Eleanor's cruelty and her father's cowardice, and the town's judgment. She was in a place where the only expectations were honest work and mutual respect. She had a room of her own, a bolt on her door, and a future that was, for the first time in her adult life, undecided. Martha pulled the quilt up to her chin and let herself cry. Not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being safe. The tears came quietly, soaking into the pillow that now belonged to her. In the room that was hers, in a cabin where she was wanted rather than tolerated. In the main room, Caleb sat in his rocking chair, carving a piece of wood by firelight. He heard the quiet sounds of Martha's crying through the thin wall and felt his own chest tighten with sympathy. He'd heard Sarah cry like that too, in the early days of their marriage when she was homesick and frightened of the wilderness. He'd learned then that sometimes people just needed to release what they'd been holding inside. And the kindest thing you could do was give them space to do it. He kept carving, the rhythmic scrape of his knife against wood, a gentle soundtrack to Martha's tears. He was making a new spoon to replace one that had cracked. Simple, useful work that kept his hands busy while his mind wandered. He hoped he'd done the right thing today. He hoped he hadn't just traded Martha from one form of captivity to another. He hoped she'd come to see this place the way he did, not as a prison or an obligation, but as a sanctuary. A place where a person could be exactly who they were without apology or explanation. Time would tell. And time, at least, was something they both had. The first few weeks at the cabin passed in a rhythm that Martha found both strange and comforting. She woke each morning to the sound of Caleb stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. The familiar domestic sounds, somehow different here than they'd been at her father's house. There, such sounds had signaled the beginning of another day of invisible labor and silent judgment. Here they meant partnership and purpose. Martha discovered that she genuinely enjoyed the work. Cooking for someone who appreciated her efforts and said so plainly was a revelation. Caleb never took a meal for granted, always thanked her, often commented specifically on what he liked. When she made her mother's recipe for apple cake using fruit from Caleb's small orchard, he'd gone quiet after the first bite, then said simply, "That's the best thing I've eaten in 6 years." Coming from a man who spoke carefully and meant what he said. The compliment had warmed her more than she'd expected. The cabin itself responded to her care. She organized the shelves, mended curtains that had developed tears, scrubbed floors that hadn't seen proper attention in years. Not because Caleb was slovenly, he wasn't, but because a bachelor living alone simply had different priorities than someone creating a home. Martha found satisfaction in bringing order and beauty to the space, in making it feel less like a survivalist's shelter and more like a place where people actually lived. Caleb, for his part, kept his word about everything. He respected her privacy, absolutely. never entering her room without permission, never making assumptions about her time or her person. He taught her things she needed to know: how to read the weather by the behavior of birds, how to tell which wild plants were safe to eat, how to handle the rifle he kept by the door in case of bears or mountain lions. He treated her like an intelligent adult capable of learning, rather than a fragile thing to be protected or controlled. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Caleb came back from checking his trapline with unexpected excitement on his weathered face. "Got something to show you," he said, gesturing for Martha to follow him to the porch. There, positioned to catch the late afternoon light, sat a rocking chair. But this wasn't just any chair, it was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, made from honey-colored pine, with armrests carved in gentle curves and a seat shaped to cradle the body comfortably. The wood had been sanded so smooth it seemed to glow, and the joints were so perfectly fitted they looked seamless. "Did you make this?" Martha asked, running her fingers along one of the armrests. "Started it about 2 years ago," Caleb admitted, a hint of self-consciousness in his voice. "Couldn't seem to finish it, though. Kept finding reasons to put it aside. But these last few weeks, with you here, the cabin feeling more like a home again, I don't know, it seemed like the right time to complete it." Martha looked at him, understanding what he wasn't quite saying. He'd started this chair in the lonely years after Sarah's death, probably imagining companionship, family, a future that seemed impossibly distant. And now, with Martha's presence filling some of that emptiness, he'd found the motivation to finish what he'd started. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "The most beautiful piece of furniture I've ever seen. Sit in it," Caleb urged. "Made it to be used, not just looked at." Martha lowered herself into the chair and immediately understood the care that had gone into its construction. It fit her body perfectly, the height just right for her feet to touch the ground, the back supporting her without stiffness. When she rocked gently, the motion was smooth and silent. The chair perfectly balanced. "Caleb," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." "Don't have to say anything," he replied. "Just thought you should have a comfortable place to sit in the evenings. You work hard all day. You deserve to rest easy." They fell into a routine of sitting together on the porch each evening after dinner, weather permitting. Martha in her rocking chair, Caleb in his straight-backed one, both watching the sun set behind the mountains while they talked about small things, the garden plans for next spring, stories from their pasts, observations about the changing season. These conversations were easy and unforced, the kind that happened naturally between people who were becoming friends. It was during one of these evening talks that Martha first opened up about her mother's death and everything that had followed. She'd been holding it inside for so long that once she started talking, the words poured out. The grief of losing Caroline, the betrayal of her father's remarriage, the systematic cruelty of Eleanor's campaign to diminish and ultimately dispose of her. Caleb listened without interruption, his face growing darker as the story unfolded. When she finally fell silent, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I'm not a violent man by nature," he said carefully. "I've killed when I had to. War will do that to a person, and survival out here sometimes requires it. But I've never hit a woman and never would. That said, your stepmother tests that principle. What she did to you wasn't just cruel, it was evil. Small, petty evil, but evil nonetheless." "She's not worth the anger," Martha said, though hearing someone validate her experience felt like a balm on old wounds. "Maybe not," Caleb agreed. "But you're worth the anger on your behalf. Someone should have protected you. Your father should have protected you. The fact that he didn't, that's on him, and he'll have to live with that failure for the rest of his life." He turned to look at her directly. "You know that what happened wasn't your fault, right? None of it. Not your mother dying, not your father's weakness, not Eleanor's cruelty. You didn't deserve any of that, and it had nothing to do with who you are as a person." Martha felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Sometimes I wonder if I'd been different, smaller, prettier, more like Penelope. Maybe things would have been easier." "Maybe," Caleb said bluntly. "Or maybe Eleanor would have found some other reason to make your life hell, because that's who she is. a small person who makes herself feel big by diminishing others. But here's what I know for certain. I wouldn't want you to be any different than you are. You're strong and kind and resilient. You've survived things that would have broken lesser people. That's worth more than being small or pretty or whatever the hell society says women should be. He paused, then added more gently, and for what it's worth, I think you're beautiful. Not in spite of how you look, but because of who you are. Real beauty comes from inside, from character and strength and compassion. The rest is just window dressing. Martha couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. No one had ever said such things to her, had ever looked at her and seen worth rather than deficiency. She managed a whispered thank you, hoping he understood how much his words meant. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but something had changed between them. A deeper trust had formed, a recognition that they were both people who'd been hurt by life and were trying, in their own ways, to heal. A few days later, Caleb suggested they visit the Anderson family. You should meet some neighbors, he said over breakfast. Mrs. Anderson's been asking about you. Word travels even out here. She's good people, and I think you'd like each other. They rode to the Anderson homestead together, Martha growing more confident in her riding with each trip. The Andersons proved to be exactly as Caleb had described. Warm, welcoming people who treated Martha with genuine friendliness. Jack Anderson was a rancher in his 40s, weathered and practical. His wife, Ruth, was a round, cheerful woman about Martha's age, who seemed delighted to have another woman within visiting distance. Finally, Ruth exclaimed, embracing Martha like they were old friends. I've been surrounded by men and cattle for 3 years. Do you know how nice it is to talk to someone who understands the difference between muslin and calico? The two women talked for hours, while Caleb and Jack discussed cattle prices and weather predictions. Ruth wanted to know everything. How Martha had ended up with Caleb, what life in the cabin was like, whether she was happy. Martha found herself being more honest than she'd intended, drawn out by Ruth's genuine interest and lack of judgment. Caleb's a good man, Ruth said, as they sat on her porch shelling beans. Lost his wife the year before we moved out here, but Jack knew him from before and always spoke highly of him. He's the kind who'll help a neighbor without being asked and never mention it after. We were real glad to hear he had someone up at his place again. That cabin was too quiet for too long. We're not, Martha started, then wasn't sure how to finish. It's not a real marriage. We're just helping each other. Ruth gave her a knowing look. Honey, sometimes the best marriages start exactly that way. People helping each other, building trust, becoming friends first. All that passionate romance folks sing about in songs, it burns hot and fast and often burns out just as quick. But friendship and respect, that lasts. That's the foundation you build a real life on. The words stayed with Martha on the ride home. She found herself sneaking glances at Caleb as they rode, seeing him with fresh eyes. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way she'd never really considered before. More than that, he was steady and kind and treated her like an equal. The thought of actually being married to him, truly married, in all the ways that mattered, didn't frighten her the way it might have a month ago. That night, as they sat on the porch in their respective chairs, Martha broached a subject that had been on her mind. The circuit preacher, she began. When does he usually come through? Caleb looked at her with raised eyebrows. Generally in late October before the heavy snows start. Why? I've been thinking about what you said, about marriage being a protection, making things proper in the eyes of the law and society. And I think, if you're still willing, I'd like to do that. Get married, I mean. When the preacher comes. Caleb set down the piece of wood he'd been carving. You sure? There's no rush, Martha. You don't owe me anything. I know, she said. But I'm not asking out of obligation. I'm asking because this feels right. Being here feels right. You feel right, and I'd like to make it official, to commit to building something lasting here. She took a breath, gathering courage. I know you said it would just be a legal arrangement, that nothing would have to change. And if that's all you want, I'll respect that. But I want you to know I'd be open to it being more. If that's something you wanted too, eventually, when we're both ready. Caleb was very still, his grey eyes searching her face in the fading light. Martha, I need you to be clear about what you're saying. Because I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. And I don't want you to feel pressured into anything. I'm saying I care about you, Martha replied, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. I'm saying these weeks here have been the happiest I've been in years. I'm saying I can imagine a future with you, a real future as your true wife, not just your housekeeper. But I also know that's a big step, and if you need time to think about it, or if you're not interested in that way, I'll understand. Caleb stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the darkening mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I've thought about it, he admitted. More than I probably should have, given how short a time you've been here. I've thought about what it would be like to really share this life with someone again. To not just have someone living in my cabin, but building a real partnership. Maybe even, he stopped, then continued. Sarah and I wanted children. Never happened for us, but it was something we both hoped for. I'm not so old that ship has sailed, and you're certainly young enough. I've thought about that too. He turned to face her. But I need you to want this for the right reasons. Not because you're grateful, not because you feel like you owe me, and not because you think it's your only option. If we're going to do this, really do this, it has to be because we both want to build a life together. Martha stood and crossed to him, taking his calloused hand in hers. I want this, she said clearly. I want to marry you, Caleb Stone. I want to be your wife in every sense of the word. I want to build a future here with you. And yes, someday I'd like children too, if we're blessed with them. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. Caleb's other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek with infinite gentleness. Then yes, he said softly. Yes, we'll marry when the preacher comes, and we'll build something real together, something that honors what we've both lost while looking forward to what we might gain. He leaned forward and kissed her, their first kiss, gentle and respectful, but full of promise. Martha felt something bloom in her chest, warm and bright and utterly unexpected. This was what it felt like to be chosen, to be valued, to be loved not in spite of who she was, but because of it. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. The future suddenly seemed full of possibility rather than dread, and Martha realized with a start that she was genuinely happy. After so many years of merely surviving, she was finally truly living. Word came 2 weeks later that the circuit preacher would be passing through the territory. He'd hold services at a small church near the Anderson Ranch, and any couples wanting to be married should come ready with witnesses and whatever celebration they could manage. The news sent Martha into a flurry of preparation, not because she wanted an elaborate wedding, but because she wanted to mark the occasion with proper care and attention. The evening after they received the news, Caleb approached Martha with something held carefully in his calloused hands. She was mending one of his shirts by lamplight, her needle moving in small, precise stitches. He cleared his throat, and she looked up to find him standing before her with an expression she'd never seen, somewhere between hopeful and nervous. I have something for you, he said. Been thinking about it since you agreed to marry me, trying to figure out if it was right or not. Decided today that it is. He opened his hands to reveal a small object wrapped in soft cloth. Martha set aside her mending and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a ring, delicate gold with a small, simple band. It caught the lamplight and gleamed warmly. This was Sarah's wedding ring, Caleb said quietly. Before you say anything, hear me out. I know some women might find it strange or uncomfortable to wear a first wife's ring, but Sarah was a good woman with a generous heart, and I think if she could speak now, she'd want this ring to go to someone who'd value it, someone who'd bring light back into this house the way she once did. He paused, then continued. The thing is, it's too small for your finger. Sarah had tiny hands, could barely make a fist without it looking delicate. So I was thinking, with your permission, I'd take it to the blacksmith near the Anderson place. He does fine metalwork. He could resize it to fit you properly, add a little more gold to the band without changing its character. Martha looked at the ring, then at Caleb, her eyes filling with tears. The gesture was so thoughtful, so full of trust and inclusion. He wasn't asking her to replace Sarah or pretend the first marriage hadn't mattered. He was asking her to be part of a continuing story, to honor the past while building a future. That would be beautiful, she said softly. I'd be honored to wear Sarah's ring. And I think you're right. I think she'd want it to be used, to be part of a new beginning, rather than locked away gathering dust. Caleb's relief was visible. I'll ride over tomorrow then. Should have it back in time for the wedding. The next few days passed in a pleasant blur of preparation. Martha had one decent dress, dark blue calico, that she'd sewn herself years ago and kept carefully maintained. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and well-fitted, and Ruth Anderson insisted on lending her a beautiful lace collar that had belonged to her mother. Something borrowed, Ruth said with a knowing smile. You need that for luck. Martha found herself touched by the gesture and by Ruth's growing friendship. The other woman had been unfailingly kind, offering advice and assistance without ever being intrusive or judgmental. She'd volunteered to make a simple wedding cake, and her husband Jack had offered to serve as Caleb's witness. The night before the wedding, Martha couldn't sleep. She sat in her room, soon to be just the guest room, as she'd be sharing Caleb's after tomorrow, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. 2 months ago, she'd been sold like property, convinced her life was effectively over. Now she was about to marry a good man who respected her, in a ceremony that would be her free choice rather than an obligation or escape. She took out her mother's locket, opening it to look at the photograph inside. I hope you'd be happy for me, Mama, she whispered to the image. I hope you'd like him. I think you would. He's kind, like Papa used to be before everything changed. And he makes me feel safe, valued, like I matter. A soft knock came at her door. Martha? Caleb's voice was low, respectful. You all right in there? Saw your light was still on. She opened the door to find him standing there in his nightshirt, hair tousled from sleep he clearly hadn't found either. Can't sleep, she admitted. Me neither, he said with a slight smile. Keep thinking tomorrow might be a dream I'll wake up from. Figured I'd better check you were real and still here. Martha laughed softly. I'm real, and I'll still be here in the morning. Ready to become your wife, if you're ready to become my husband. More than ready, Caleb said. Then with characteristic directness, he added, I know we've talked about the wedding night, about taking things at your pace. I just want you to know again, we can go as slow as you need. There's no rush for anything. This marriage is about building a partnership first. Everything else can come as it comes. I know, Martha said, reaching out to take his hand. And I appreciate that more than I can say. But Caleb, I'm not afraid. Nervous maybe, but not afraid. I trust you, completely. He squeezed her hand gently, then released it. Best try to get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. Big day, Martha agreed, smiling as he turned to go. Good night, Caleb. Good night, Martha. Last night I'll be saying that to Miss Hawkins. Next time, it'll be Mrs. Stone. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter, but the sky brilliantly blue. Martha dressed with care, her hands only shaking slightly as she fastened the buttons on her dress. Ruth arrived early to help with her hair, pinning it up in a style more elegant than Martha's usual simple braid. You look beautiful, Ruth said warmly. Truly beautiful. Caleb's not going to be able to take his eyes off you. They rode to the small church together, Martha and Ruth in the Anderson wagon, Caleb and Jack on horseback. A handful of other neighbors had gathered, curious about the mountain man's unexpected wedding. Martha recognized a few faces from her occasional trips to town for supplies, and they greeted her with more warmth than she'd expected. The church was simple, rough-hewn logs and plain wooden benches, but someone had decorated it with autumn wildflowers and pine boughs. The circuit preacher was an elderly man with kind eyes and a voice that carried authority without harshness. Martha stood beside Caleb at the front of the church, acutely aware of his solid presence next to her. He wore his best clothes, still simple but clean and well cared for. When she glanced at him, she found him already looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was admiration there, yes, but also tenderness and something deeper, a recognition of the significance of what they were about to do. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. The preacher spoke about marriage as a partnership of equals, about the importance of respect and communication, about building a life together based on mutual support rather than dominance or submission. Martha found herself nodding along, appreciating his words. When it came time for the vows, Caleb's voice was steady and sure. I, Caleb Stone, take you, Martha Hawkins, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to respect you, to support you, to value you as my equal partner in all things. I promise to build a life with you based on honesty and kindness. I promise to really see you every day, and to never take for granted the gift of your presence in my life. Martha's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was equally steady when she spoke. I, Martha Hawkins, take you, Caleb Stone, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to respect you, to support you, to value you as my equal partner in all things. I promise to build a life with you based on honesty and kindness. I promise to really see you every day, and to never take for granted the gift of your presence in my life. When Caleb slipped the resized ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly. The gold was warm from his pocket, and Martha could see where the blacksmith had carefully added to the band, making it just large enough without changing its essential character. She looked down at her hand, at this symbol of commitment and continuity, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared. Mr. Stone, you may kiss your bride. Caleb leaned in slowly, giving Martha time to meet him halfway. Their kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise. When they pulled apart, both were smiling, and the small congregation erupted in applause and well wishes. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. Ruth had indeed made a cake, a beautiful creation flavored with honey and studded with dried fruit. There was music from a neighbor who'd brought his fiddle, and dancing that Martha initially watched from the sidelines until Caleb pulled her onto the floor. I'm not a good dancer, she protested. Neither am I, he admitted with a grin. We'll muddle through together. They muddled through beautifully, moving in simple patterns that required no particular skill, just the willingness to hold each other and sway to the music. Martha found herself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Ruth pulled her aside during a break in the music. I'm so happy for you both, she said warmly. You're good for him, you know. I can see it in the way he looks at you, the way he carries himself. He's lighter somehow. And you're practically glowing. I'll come with you, she said. I'd like to see Mr. Garrett. Let him know I'm well. Caleb studied her face. You sure? We don't have to go if you're not ready. I'm ready, Martha assured him. Besides, Penelope's wedding is this week, isn't it? Maybe we should make an appearance, if only to show Eleanor that I'm thriving despite her best efforts. They made the journey on a clear, cold day, the world transformed by snow into something pristine and beautiful. As they rode into Cedar Ridge, Martha noticed people staring. Word had clearly spread about her marriage to Caleb Stone, and the townspeople didn't quite know what to make of it. The woman they dismissed as unmarriageable had not only found a husband, but one who clearly valued her. If the way he helped her down from the horse and kept a protective hand at her back was any indication. Mr. Garrett's face lit up when they entered the general store. He came around the counter and embraced Martha warmly, tears in his weathered eyes. Look at you, he said, holding her at arm's length. You're glowing, girl. Mountain life agrees with you. It does, Martha agreed, smiling. And I have you to thank in part. If you hadn't vouched for me to Caleb, he might not have intervened that day. All I did was tell the truth, Mr. Garrett said gruffly. The rest was you and him, figuring out you belonged together. He turned to Caleb, extending his hand. You're treating her right, I hope? Better than right, Caleb replied, shaking firmly. She's the best thing that's happened to me in 6 years, and I remind myself of that fact every single day. They spent a pleasant hour catching up while Caleb gathered their supplies. Mr. Garrett filled them in on town gossip, who'd gotten engaged, who'd had babies, who'd fallen on hard times. He seemed to be carefully avoiding mention of the Hawkins family until Martha brought it up herself. "How's the wedding planning going?" she asked. Penelope must be beside herself with excitement. Mr. Garrett's expression darkened. "About that, there's been some developments you should probably know about. Eleanor's been trying to keep it quiet, but word got out about what she did to you. Some folks are refusing to attend the wedding on principle. The banker's family is none too pleased about the association, and there's talk they might call the whole thing off." Martha felt a complicated swirl of emotions. She didn't wish Penelope ill. Her stepsister had been weak and complicit, but not actively cruel like Eleanor. "That's unfortunate," she said carefully. "There's more," Mr. Garrett continued, lowering his voice. "Your father's been asking about you, wanting to know if you're all right, if you're happy. I told him you were thriving, that you'd married a good man." He seemed relieved, I suppose, but also guilty as hell, which he ought to be. Before Martha could respond, the store's door opened and Jacob Hawkins himself walked in. He froze when he saw Martha, his face going pale, then flushing with what might have been shame or perhaps just shock. "Martha," he said, her name barely above a whisper. "Hello, Papa," Martha replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Jacob's eyes moved to Caleb, taking in his solid presence at Martha's side, the protective way he stood close to her. You're married?" "I am," Martha confirmed. "This is my husband, Caleb Stone. Caleb, this is my father, Jacob Hawkins." The two men assessed each other in silence. Jacob seemed diminished somehow, smaller than Martha remembered, worn down by guilt, or perhaps just by living with Eleanor. Caleb, by contrast, stood tall and sure, his hand finding Martha's and squeezing gently in support. "I'm glad you found someone," Jacob said finally. I've worried about you. What Eleanor did, what I allowed her to do." His voice broke. "There's no excuse for it. I failed you as a father. I know that, but I want you to know I'm glad you're safe and cared for." Martha felt years of hurt and anger warring with the faint ember of love she'd once held for this man. She could hold on to the bitterness, let it poison whatever years she had left with him. Or she could choose to release it, to free herself from its weight. "I forgive you, Papa," she said quietly. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to stop carrying that hurt. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean letting you back into my life as though nothing happened. I have a new life now, a good life, and I'm not going to risk it by keeping ties to people who've proven they can't be trusted." Jacob nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "That's fair. More than fair. I'm glad you're happy, Martha. Your mother would have wanted that for you." "Don't," Martha said, a flash of anger breaking through her careful calm. "Don't invoke Mama's memory to make yourself feel better about betraying everything she stood for. She would have protected me. She would have chosen me over social standing and Eleanor's ambitions. You didn't. That's the truth, and we both have to live with it." She took a breath, steadying herself. "But I am happy now, happier than I've ever been. So in a strange way, your failure led me to where I needed to be. I can be grateful for that without absolving you of responsibility for your choices." Jacob nodded again, seeming to age before her eyes. "I understand. I'll leave you be. But if you ever need anything—" "I won't," Martha said firmly. "I have everything I need." After Jacob left, Martha sagged slightly against Caleb, who wrapped a steady arm around her. "That was harder than I thought it would be," she admitted. "You did well," Caleb said. "Said what needed saying, no more and no less." That took strength. They finished their business at the store and were preparing to leave when they heard a commotion outside. Through the window, Martha could see Eleanor and Penelope approaching, apparently on their way to the seamstress for a final dress fitting. Eleanor spotted them through the store window, and her face contorted with fury. She burst through the door, Penelope trailing reluctantly behind. "How dare you show your face here?" Eleanor spat at Martha. "After all the trouble you've caused, spreading lies about this family. The only lies being spread are yours," Mr. Garrett interrupted, his voice hard. "And they're finally catching up with you, Eleanor. Folks know what you did, and they're not impressed. Eleanor's attention shifted to Martha's left hand, to the ring glinting there. Her eyes narrowed. "So you've managed to trap some mountain savage into marrying you. How enterprising. Though I can't imagine it will last. Once he realizes what a burden you are, he'll cast you aside just like everyone else has." Martha felt Caleb tense beside her, but she laid a calming hand on his arm. This was her battle to fight. "You're wrong about so many things, Eleanor," Martha said calmly. "But mostly you're wrong about what matters in life. You measure worth in appearance and social standing. You see people as commodities to be traded for advantage. And that hollowness inside you, that inability to see value in anything but status, that's going to leave you lonely and bitter when all your careful planning comes to nothing." She stepped closer, looking Eleanor directly in the eye. "I don't need your approval or your acceptance. I don't need anything from you at all. I have a husband who loves me, a home I've helped build, and a future full of possibility. That's more than you'll ever have, no matter how many social connections you cultivate or how perfectly you arrange your daughter's wedding." Eleanor's face went purple with rage. "You ungrateful little—" "Enough," Caleb said, his voice quiet, but carrying unmistakable authority. "You'll speak to my wife with respect, or you won't speak to her at all. She's given you more consideration than you deserve, and I won't stand here and let you abuse her further." He guided Martha toward the door, but as they passed Penelope, Martha paused. Her stepsister looked miserable, tears streaming down her face. On impulse, Martha stopped. "Penelope," she said gently, "I hope your wedding is beautiful. I hope you find happiness with Thomas, despite everything. You don't have to become your mother. You can choose to be better." "It's not too late for that." Penelope's sob caught in her throat, and she reached out, grabbing Martha's hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything. I should have stood up for you. I should have said something. I should have—" "It's all right," Martha said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "We both survived Eleanor's house. That's something." They left the store and were walking toward where Rosie was tied when a voice called out, "Mrs. Stone, a moment, please." They turned to find a thin, nervous-looking man hurrying toward them, the same Mr. Guthrie who'd accompanied Augustus Drummond the day of the attempted sale. He was carrying a leather satchel and looked anxious. "I'm glad I caught you," he said, slightly out of breath. "I've been trying to figure out how to contact you. There's been a development you need to know about." "What kind of development?" Caleb asked warily. Guthrie glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice. "Can we speak somewhere private? It's not something that should be discussed on the street." They returned to the general store, and Mr. Garrett allowed them use of his small back office. Once the door was closed, Guthrie opened his satchel and withdrew several official-looking documents. "I need to start by apologizing," he began. "I was complicit in what happened to you, Mrs. Stone, and I'm deeply ashamed of that. But I want to make amends by bringing you information you have a right to know." He spread the documents on the desk. "I work as a clerk at the county land office, in addition to occasionally helping Drummond with his business dealings. A few weeks ago, I was filing some inheritance paperwork and came across something that caught my attention, documents relating to the Hawkins family." Martha leaned forward, her heart beginning to pound. "What kind of documents?" "Your maternal grandmother, Caroline's mother, died 2 years ago in Boston," Guthrie explained. "She left a substantial inheritance, property, investments, cash. According to her will, it was to be divided equally among her descendants. Your mother was her only child, which meant the entire estate should have gone to you as Caroline's heir." He pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. "This is a letter from the estate lawyer in Boston, addressed to Eleanor Hawkins. It arrived about 6 months before you were sent away. In it, the lawyer explains about the inheritance and asks for verification that you, Martha Hawkins, are alive and well so they can transfer the funds." Martha's hands shook as she took the letter. The words swam before her eyes. "Substantial estate, rightful heir, please confirm," Eleanor wrote back. Guthrie continued, pulling out another document. "This is a copy of her response. She claimed that you had died of fever the previous winter. She provided false documentation, a forged death certificate, and requested that the inheritance be transferred to her as your stepmother and closest living relative. The room seemed to spin. Martha gripped the edge of the desk, trying to process what she was hearing. She forged my death? Yes, Guthrie confirmed. The Boston lawyers accepted the documentation and prepared to transfer the inheritance to her. But there were legal complications. Apparently, your grandmother's will was very specific about bloodline inheritance. It took months to sort out, and Eleanor was getting anxious about the money arriving before she had to before she had to deal with you being visibly alive. So that's why she was so determined to get rid of me, Martha said, the pieces falling into place. Not just because I embarrassed her, but because she needed me gone before the inheritance came through. If I was in another territory with Drummond, or if I'd simply disappeared, no one would question her story. Exactly, Guthrie said. And it almost worked. The inheritance was transferred to her account 3 weeks ago, over $50,000. The amount was staggering. More money than Martha could even conceptualize. Life-changing money. Money that should have been hers. Eleanor has it all. Caleb asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. For now, Guthrie said. But that's why I'm here. That money was obtained through fraud, through forged documents and false claims. With proper legal action, you could contest the transfer. You could get back what's rightfully yours. He pulled out one final document. This is an affidavit I've prepared, swearing to what I know about Eleanor's actions, including the attempted sale to Drummond. I also have testimony from Drummond himself. He's angry at being outbid by Mr. Stone and is willing to confirm that Eleanor told him she needed you gone before certain legal matters were finalized. With this evidence and your own testimony, a judge would almost certainly rule in your favor. Martha sat heavily in Mr. Garrett's chair, trying to absorb everything. The cruelty she'd suffered hadn't been random or even just the result of Eleanor's natural meanness. It had been calculated, premeditated, designed to steal her inheritance and dispose of her permanently. Why are you helping me? She asked Guthrie. What do you gain from this? The clerk's face reddened. Nothing, financially. But I gain the ability to sleep at night, Mrs. Stone. I've done things I'm not proud of in service of making money. But what Eleanor planned, what I helped enable, that crossed a line. I have daughters of my own. The thought of someone treating them the way you were treated makes me sick. This is my attempt to make things right. Caleb placed a hand on Martha's shoulder. What do you want to do? He asked quietly. This is your decision, your inheritance, your justice to seek or not seek. Martha looked at the document spread before her, tangible proof of Eleanor's malice and greed. $50,000. A fortune that could transform their lives, buy land, build a real ranch, ensure security for any children they might have. But pursuing it would mean legal battles, time in courtrooms, prolonged contact with Eleanor and her father, and all the ugliness of Cedar Ridge. It would mean dragging the past into her carefully built present. I need time to think about this, Martha said finally. It's a lot to process. Of course, Guthrie said. I'll leave copies of everything with you. When you're ready to proceed, contact the law office in the next county. They're not connected to Cedar Ridge politics and will handle the case fairly. I've already provided them with preliminary information. After Guthrie left, Martha, Caleb, and Mr. Garrett sat in heavy silence. Finally, the old storekeeper spoke. You should pursue this, Martha. That money is yours by right. Eleanor's a thief and a fraud, and she should face consequences. I know, Martha said quietly. But at what cost? The peace I've found, the new life I'm building, is it worth risking that to fight for money we don't strictly need? It's not about the money, Mr. Garrett argued. It's about justice. It's about making sure Eleanor doesn't profit from her cruelty. He's right about that, Caleb added. But he's also right that it's your decision, Martha. I'll support whatever you choose. We have a good life up in the mountains. We don't need $50,000 to be happy. But we also shouldn't let evil go unpunished just because it's convenient. Martha gathered the documents, her mind churning. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, both of them lost in thought. By the time they arrived home, snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing their world in white. That night, lying in bed beside Caleb, Martha finally spoke the thoughts that had been circling her mind all day. If I pursue this, it's not just about getting the money back. It's about exposing Eleanor completely, making public exactly what she did. It's about protecting other people from her schemes. And it's about honoring my mother's memory. That inheritance came from her family, and Eleanor has no right to it. Those are good reasons, Caleb said. But I'm afraid, Martha admitted. Afraid of what it will cost emotionally. Afraid of being dragged back into that world. Afraid that the bitterness of fighting this battle will poison the happiness we've found. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. What if you didn't have to do it alone? He finally said. What if I stood beside you through every minute of it? What if we made sure that no matter how ugly the legal battle got, you came home every night to this cabin, to this life, to me reminding you that Eleanor can't touch what we've built? Martha turned to face him in the darkness. You'd do that? Go through all of that for money that was never yours? I'd do it for you, Caleb corrected. For your right to what's yours. For the principle that people like Eleanor shouldn't get away with evil. And yes, I'll admit, for the practical reality that $50,000 could give our children, our future children, opportunities we couldn't provide otherwise. College educations, travel, choices. That's not nothing. Martha reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. Then I'll do it, she said. I'll fight for what's mine, but on my terms, in my time, without letting it consume me. And when it's over, when we've won or lost, I'm walking away from Cedar Ridge for good. No more looking back. Fair enough, Caleb agreed. We'll seek justice, but we won't let the seeking destroy us. And no matter what happens, we have each other in this life. That's what really matters. They fell asleep holding each other, their future uncertain, but their commitment unwavering. The next morning would bring decisions and actions that would change everything. But for now, they had this moment of peace, this knowledge that whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them together. The next morning brought clarity along with the winter sunlight. Martha and Caleb sat at their kitchen table, the inheritance documents spread before them, and began to formulate a plan. They would pursue justice methodically and carefully, using the law rather than emotion to guide their actions. Their first step was to visit the law office in the next county, as Guthrie had suggested. The attorney there, a sharp-minded woman named Elizabeth Blackwell, reviewed their evidence with growing interest and outrage. This is fraud. In plain and simple, Mrs. Blackwell said, tapping the forged death certificate. Your stepmother knowingly made false claims to steal your rightful inheritance. The law is very clear on such matters, and you have an excellent case. However, I must warn you, this will not be a quick or easy process. Mrs. Hawkins will fight back, and given her social connections in Cedar Ridge, she may attempt to manipulate local sentiment against you. Let her try, Martha said quietly. The truth is the truth, and I have documentation to prove it. Mrs. Blackwell smiled approvingly. Good, then here's what we'll do. First, we'll file a formal complaint with the territorial court, requesting that the inheritance transfer be frozen pending investigation. This will prevent Eleanor from spending or hiding the money while the case proceeds. Second, we'll gather additional testimony. I understand Mr. Guthrie and Mr. Drummond are willing to provide statements about Eleanor's attempts to dispose of you around the same time she claimed you died. That establishes a pattern of deception. She pulled out a clean sheet of paper and began making notes. Third, we'll need your father's testimony. I know that's difficult, but his statement about Eleanor's behavior and timeline would be valuable. Does he know about the inheritance fraud? I don't think so, Martha said. He knew Eleanor wanted me gone, but I doubt she shared her financial motivations with him. Then his testimony might carry even more weight, a husband testifying against his wife's actions without financial motive to do so. We'll approach him carefully, but it's worth pursuing. Mrs. Blackwell looked up. How do you feel about testifying publicly? There will likely be a hearing, possibly a trial. You'll need to tell your story in front of a judge, possibly a jury. With Eleanor present and likely her attorney attempting to discredit you, Martha felt Caleb's hand find hers under the table, warm and steady. "I can do it," she said. "I've survived worse than telling the truth." Over the following weeks, they worked tirelessly to build their case. Mr. Guthrie proved invaluable, providing not only his own testimony, but helping them trace the paper trail of Eleanor's fraud. He located the original correspondence from Boston, found witnesses who'd seen Eleanor receive certain letters she'd claimed never arrived, and even discovered that she'd paid a corrupt county clerk to create the false death certificate, Augustus Drummond, motivated by spite and a desire to distance himself from the scandal. Provided a detailed account of Eleanor's proposition, how she'd offered him Martha plus a percentage of an unnamed windfall if he'd take her far away and ensure she never returned to Montana. The most difficult testimony to secure was Jacob Hawkins's. Martha and Caleb visited him at his home when Eleanor was out making wedding preparations. Jacob looked older than ever, worn down by guilt and the weight of his choices. "I didn't know about the inheritance," he said when they laid out the evidence. "I swear to you, Martha, I didn't know. Eleanor told me she was arranging a position for you as a housekeeper, that it was for your own good, since you had no marriage prospects here. I should have questioned it more, should have protected you, but I didn't know she was stealing from you. Will you testify to what you do know?" Caleb asked. "The timeline, Eleanor's urgency in getting rid of Martha, anything she might have said about needing Martha gone by a certain date." Jacob nodded slowly. "I'll testify. It's the least I can do. Maybe the only thing I can do to begin making amends." As they were leaving, Jacob called out to Martha one more time. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said, his voice breaking. "Not of me, never of me, but of you, standing up for yourself, fighting for what's right. Caroline always had a strong sense of justice. You're her daughter in all the ways that matter." Martha nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and let Caleb lead her away. The legal machinery ground slowly forward. Mrs. Blackwell filed their complaint, and a judge issued an immediate order freezing Eleanor's access to the inheritance funds, pending investigation. When Eleanor received the notification, her rage was apparently spectacular. Mr. Garrett reported that she'd come into the general store, screaming about ungrateful stepdaughters and false accusations. Until he'd asked her to leave, word of the lawsuit spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. The town divided into factions, some supporting Eleanor, convinced that Martha was a troublemaker trying to destroy a respectable family, while others rallied behind Martha, finally seeing Eleanor's true nature. The social consequences for Penelope's wedding were severe. Half the invited guests declined to attend, not wanting to be associated with a family embroiled in such scandal. Ruth Anderson visited the cabin one afternoon, bringing news from town. "Penelope came to see me," she reported, sitting at Martha's kitchen table with a cup of tea. "Poor thing was in tears. The wedding's been postponed indefinitely. Thomas's family insisted on it until the legal matters are resolved. They don't want their son marrying into a family accused of fraud and attempted trafficking." Martha felt a pang of sympathy despite everything. "How is she holding up?" "Not well," Ruth admitted. "But here's the thing. I think this might be the best thing that could have happened to her. She's finally seeing her mother clearly, seeing what Eleanor's capable of. She asked me to tell you she's sorry, really deeply sorry. And she said if you needed her to testify about anything she witnessed, she would do it." This unexpected offer added another layer to their case. Penelope could testify about the timeline, about her mother's obsession with getting rid of Martha before a certain date, about conversations she'd overheard regarding money and inheritance. Her testimony would be particularly damaging because it came from Eleanor's own daughter. Martha sent word through Ruth that she accepted Penelope's offer and appreciated her willingness to tell the truth. It felt strange, this tentative rebuilding of a relationship that had never really existed, but Martha recognized courage when she saw it. Penelope was risking her mother's wrath and her own social standing to do what was right. That counted for something. As the hearing date approached, Martha found herself struggling with anxiety. She would wake in the night, heart pounding, imagining Eleanor's attorney tearing apart her character, painting her as a vengeful, greedy woman who'd invented this entire story out of spite. Caleb would hold her through these episodes, reminding her of the evidence, of the truth, of the fact that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. "Eleanor's going to say terrible things about me," Martha said one sleepless night. "She's going to tell everyone I'm making this up because I'm bitter about being sent away. Let her say what she wants," Caleb replied calmly. "You have documents. You have witnesses. You have a paper trail that proves every word you're saying. Her opinion against your evidence, that's not even a contest. But what if people believe her anyway? What if they decide I'm the villain in this story? Then those people don't matter," Caleb said firmly. "The people who matter, the people who know you, who've seen your character, they already know the truth. Mr. Garrett knows. The Andersons know, I know. That's what counts." Mrs. Blackwell prepared Martha thoroughly for her testimony. They practiced questions and answers, discussed how to remain calm under cross-examination, and reviewed the documentary evidence until Martha could recite dates and details in her sleep. The attorney was impressed by Martha's composure and clarity. "You're going to do wonderfully," Mrs. Blackwell said, after one particularly grueling practice session. "You speak plainly and honestly, you don't embellish or exaggerate, and you stay focused on facts rather than emotions. A judge will appreciate that. Just remember, tell the truth, answer only what's asked, and don't let Eleanor's attorney provoke you into anger. That's all you need to do." The day before the hearing, Martha received an unexpected visitor. Penelope arrived at the cabin on horseback, looking thin and nervous. Martha invited her in, offering tea and a seat by the fire. For several minutes they sat in awkward silence, sisters who'd never been sisters, bound by circumstances neither had chosen. "Thank you for seeing me," Penelope finally said. "I wasn't sure you would." "Why wouldn't I?" Martha asked gently. "Because I was awful to you. For years I watched Mother treat you terribly, and I said nothing. I went along with it. I benefited from it." Penelope's voice broke. "I'm so ashamed of the person I was, the person I let myself become." "You were young," Martha said, "and you were under Eleanor's influence. I understand how powerful that can be. That's generous, but it doesn't excuse it," Penelope insisted. "I had a choice. I could have stood up for you, defended you, at least been kind to you in private. I did none of those things because it was easier to go along, easier to pretend it wasn't my problem." She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here to tell you that tomorrow I'm going to testify to everything I know. Mother told me not to, threatened to disown me if I did. But I'm doing it anyway. You deserve justice, and I deserve to finally do the right thing, even if it's years too late." Martha moved to sit beside her stepsister, taking her hand. "It's not too late. It's never too late to choose to be better than you were. I forgive you, Penelope, truly, and I'm grateful that you're willing to testify." They talked for another hour. Penelope sharing details about her mother's behavior that Martha hadn't known, how Eleanor had been obsessed with the inheritance from the moment she'd received the first letter, how she'd planned Martha's disposal with cold calculation, how she'd celebrated when Drummond had agreed to take Martha away. The picture that emerged was of a woman consumed by greed and willing to commit any cruelty to satisfy it. "What will you do after this is over?" Martha asked. "Once the hearing is done and, well, whatever happens with you and Thomas." "I don't know," Penelope admitted. "Thomas broke off our engagement officially yesterday. His family won't allow him to marry into a scandal, and honestly I think I'm relieved. I didn't love him, Martha. I was marrying him because Mother wanted me to, because it was the right social match. But I don't want to live like that anymore, making choices based on what looks good rather than what's right or what makes me happy." "What would make you happy?" Martha asked. Penelope smiled sadly. "I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out. Maybe I'll leave Cedar Ridge, start fresh somewhere new. Maybe I'll stay and rebuild my reputation by actually being a good person instead of just pretending to be one. Either way, I want to live differently than I have been." After Penelope left, Martha felt a strange sense of peace. Tomorrow would be difficult, but it would also be clarifying. The truth would come out, justice would be served or denied, and she would be able to move forward knowing she'd done everything in her power to right a terrible wrong. That evening, she and Caleb sat on their porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The mountains stood silent around them, witnesses to their small human drama, but ultimately indifferent to its outcome. Martha found that comforting somehow. The reminder that this legal battle, as important as it felt, was just one moment in the vast sweep of time and space. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Caleb said, "we're going to be all right. We have this cabin, this land, each other. Eleanor can't take that away, no matter what a judge decides about the money." "I know," Martha agreed. "But I want the judge to decide in our favor. Not just for the money, though that would change our lives, but for the principle of it. For the idea that people like Eleanor don't get to win, don't get to profit from their cruelty." "They won't," Caleb said with quiet certainty. "I've seen your evidence, heard the testimony that's been gathered. Eleanor's done. She just doesn't know it yet." They went to bed early, knowing they had a long day ahead. As Martha lay in Caleb's arms, listening to his steady heartbeat, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From that terrible day, when she'd been sold like property, to now, when she was fighting for her rights in a court of law. Supported by a husband who loved her and witnesses who believed in her, she thought about her mother, Caroline, and the inheritance that had sparked this whole nightmare. The money had been meant as a gift, a legacy to provide security and opportunity. Eleanor had perverted that intention, turning it into a motive for cruelty and fraud. But tomorrow, if all went well, Martha would reclaim what was rightfully hers. She would take her mother's gift and use it to build something good, a life of purpose and meaning, a future for her children, a legacy that would honor Caroline's memory properly. "I love you," she whispered to Caleb in the darkness. "I love you too," he replied, his arms tightening around her. "Now sleep. You need your rest for tomorrow." Martha closed her eyes and, surprisingly, did sleep, deeply and dreamlessly, her mind at rest in a way it hadn't been in weeks. When she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window, and Caleb was already up, preparing breakfast with quiet efficiency. Today was the day. Today, Eleanor would face the consequences of her actions. Today, justice would have its chance. They dressed carefully, Martha in her best dress, Caleb in the suit he'd worn for their wedding. They ate a light breakfast, neither having much appetite, and then made the journey to the county seat where the hearing would be held. Mrs. Blackwell met them at the courthouse steps, her expression confident and professional. "Everyone's here," she reported. "Eleanor and her attorney, your father, Penelope, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Garrett, who's come to provide character testimony. The judge is Benjamin Cartwright, fair-minded man with a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. We're in good hands." They entered the courthouse together, Martha's hand firmly in Caleb's. The hearing room was already filling with spectators. It seemed half of Cedar Ridge had turned out to witness the proceedings. Martha saw Eleanor sitting ramrod straight at one table, her face a mask of cold fury. Her attorney, a slick-looking man from the territorial capital, was arranging papers with practiced precision. At the other table, Mrs. Blackwell gestured for Martha and Caleb to sit. "Remember everything we practiced," she said quietly. "Tell the truth, stay calm, and trust the evidence." "We've got this." Judge Cartwright entered, a stern-faced man in his 60s with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Everyone rose, then sat again at his gesture. He reviewed the case file briefly, then looked up. "This is a hearing to determine whether the inheritance transferred to Mrs. Eleanor Hawkins should be frozen pending investigation of fraud allegations made by Mrs. Martha Stone. Hawkins, Mrs. Blackwell, you may present your opening statement." The attorney stood, and Martha felt her heart begin to race. This was it. The moment of truth, quite literally. Everything she and Caleb had worked for, everything she'd suffered through, everything she hoped to reclaim. It all came down to what happened in this room over the next few hours. Mrs. Blackwell began to speak, her voice clear and authoritative, laying out the case with devastating precision. Eleanor's face grew paler with each word, and Martha allowed herself a small, grim smile. Justice was coming. Finally, after so many years of suffering and silence, justice was coming, and Martha was ready to claim it. Mrs. Blackwell's opening statement painted a picture of calculated deception that left the courtroom in shocked silence. She outlined Eleanor's receipt of the inheritance notification, the forged death certificate, the desperate attempt to dispose of Martha before her continued existence could contradict the fraud. When she finished, Judge Cartwright's expression was grave. "Those are serious allegations," he said. "I trust you have evidence to support them?" "Substantial evidence, Your Honor," Mrs. Blackwell replied. "I'd like to begin by entering into evidence the following documents: the original letter from the Boston estate attorney, the forged death certificate, bank records showing the transfer of funds, and correspondence between Mrs. Eleanor Hawkins and various parties regarding her stepdaughter's disposal." She approached the bench, handing up a thick folder. Judge Cartwright reviewed each document carefully, his frown deepening as he read. Eleanor's attorney, Mr. Pemberton, tried to object on technical grounds, but the judge waved him off. "These appear to be properly authenticated documents," Judge Cartwright said. "I'll allow them into evidence. Mrs. Blackwell, call your first witness." I call Martha Stone to the stand. Martha stood on shaking legs, Caleb's encouraging squeeze of her hand giving her strength. She walked to the witness stand and was sworn in, placing her hand on the Bible and promising to tell the truth. As she sat, she caught Eleanor's eyes, cold, hateful, filled with venom. Martha looked away, focusing instead on Mrs. Blackwell's kind face. "Mrs. Stone," the attorney began gently, "please tell the court about your relationship with your stepmother." "Eleanor Hawkins," Martha took a breath and began. Her voice was quiet at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. She described her mother's death, her father's remarriage, the gradual erosion of her place in what had once been her home. She spoke of Eleanor's cruelty, both overt and subtle, of years spent being made to feel worthless and burdensome. "In the months before I was sent away," Martha continued, "Eleanor's treatment of me intensified. She became obsessed with finding a way to remove me from the household. At the time, I thought it was simply because she found my presence embarrassing, or because she wanted my room for Penelope's future nursery. I didn't know about the inheritance." "When did you learn about the inheritance?" Mrs. Blackwell asked. "Not until 6 weeks ago, when Mr. Guthrie approached me with documentation showing that my maternal grandmother had died and left her estate to me as her only surviving descendant through my mother." "And what was your reaction?" Martha's voice trembled slightly. "I was shocked. Devastated, actually. Because suddenly, everything made sense. Why Eleanor had been so determined to get rid of me, why the timing had been so urgent. She'd claimed I was dead so she could steal my inheritance. She'd tried to sell me to Augustus Drummond not out of mere cruelty, but as part of a calculated plan to make me disappear so her fraud wouldn't be discovered." Mrs. Blackwell nodded sympathetically. "Tell us about the day you were to be transferred to Mr. Drummond's custody." Martha described that terrible afternoon in vivid detail, the coldness with which Eleanor had announced the arrangement, her father's cowardice, the appearance of Drummond himself with his greedy eyes and degrading assessment. Her voice caught when she described feeling like an animal being sold at market, valued only for her capacity to work. And then what happened? Mrs. Blackwell prompted. "Caleb Stone arrived," Martha said, her eyes finding her husband in the courtroom. "He'd heard what was happening and came to intervene. He offered to pay Eleanor double what Drummond had offered, not because he wanted to own me, but because he wanted to give me a choice about my own future. He took me to his cabin and offered me refuge, respect, and eventually," her voice softened, "love. He saved my life, though I didn't know at the time that Eleanor's plans for me were even worse than I'd imagined." "Objection!" Mr. Pemberton stood abruptly. "The witness is speculating about my client's intentions." "Sustained," Judge Cartwright said. "Mrs. Stone, please stick to facts rather than assumptions about motivations." "Yes, Your Honor," Martha said. "The fact is that Eleanor told Augustus Drummond she needed me removed from Montana Territory before a specific date. The fact is that she forged a death certificate claiming I died, and used that false document to claim an inheritance that belonged to me. The fact is that she received over $50,000 that should have been mine." Mrs. Blackwell smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Stone. No further questions." Mr. Pemberton approached for cross-examination, his expression calculating. "Mrs. Stone, you've painted quite a dramatic picture of abuse and conspiracy. But isn't it true that your stepmother simply arranged employment for you when it became clear you had no marriage prospects?" "She sold me to a traveling merchant," Martha replied evenly. "That's not arranging employment. That's human trafficking." "That's a very dramatic characterization," Mr. Pemberton said dismissively. "Weren't you simply being placed in a household position, much as many young women are?" "Young women are usually consulted about such positions," Martha countered. "They're usually paid wages that they control themselves. They're usually free to leave if they choose. None of that was true in my case. I was being sold, my stepmother was being paid, and I was given no choice in the matter." Mr. Pemberton shifted tactics. "You claim your stepmother was cruel to you. Can you provide specific examples beyond hurt feelings and perceived slights?" Martha's eyes hardened. "She moved me from my childhood bedroom to a servant's room at the back of the house. She packed away all my mother's belongings and forbade me from speaking about her. She reduced my food portions while claiming it was for my own good. She excluded me from family gatherings and social events. She spoke about me as though I were a burden and an embarrassment, both to my face and behind my back. She systematically stripped away every shred of dignity and self-worth I possessed, and then, when she found a way to profit from my complete removal, she tried to erase my existence entirely." "Is that specific enough for you?" Several people in the courtroom gasped. Even Mr. Pemberton seemed momentarily taken aback by the passion in Martha's voice. He recovered quickly, but Martha could see she'd scored a point. "You married Mr. Stone very quickly after leaving your family's home," Mr. Pemberton said. "Some might say suspiciously quickly. Isn't it possible that this entire lawsuit is motivated by anger at your family and a desire for revenge?" "I married Mr. Stone because he's a good man who treats me with respect and kindness," Martha said firmly. "I brought this lawsuit because my stepmother committed fraud and theft. Those are two separate matters. My marriage has nothing to do with the fact that Eleanor forged documents and stole my inheritance. But you must admit the timing is convenient." Mr. C. Pemberton pressed. "You marry a man with resources. Suddenly you have the means to bring an expensive legal action." "My attorney is working on contingency," Martha interrupted. "My husband offered to pay her fees, but Mrs. Blackwell agreed to take the case based on its merits and collect payment only if we win. So your implication that I needed to marry for money to afford this lawsuit is incorrect." Mr. Pemberton asked several more questions, clearly trying to rattle Martha or catch her in a contradiction, but she remained calm and consistent. When he finally dismissed her with obvious frustration, she returned to her seat beside Caleb with a sense of quiet triumph. She told her truth clearly and honestly, and the judge had listened with evident attention. "You did beautifully," Caleb whispered, taking her hand. Mrs. Blackwell called her next witness, Mr. Guthrie. The nervous clerk took the stand and provided devastating testimony about Eleanor's fraud, including his own shameful participation in some of her schemes. He corroborated the timeline, confirmed the existence of the forged documents, and admitted that Eleanor had explicitly told him she needed Martha gone and forgotten before certain legal matters could be finalized. She said those exact words? Mrs. Blackwell asked. "Gone and forgotten?" "Yes, ma'am," Guthrie confirmed miserably. "She said it would be easier if the girl just disappeared entirely. That way there'd be no awkward questions if anyone from Boston came looking." Eleanor's face was white with fury, but she remained silent under her attorney's restraining hand. Next came Augustus Drummond, who clearly relished the opportunity to damage Eleanor after being denied his prize. He described their arrangement in crude detail, how much he'd agreed to pay for Martha, what services he'd expected her to perform, and most damningly, how Eleanor had promised him a percentage of a windfall she expected to receive once Martha was safely out of the territory. "She specifically mentioned receiving money?" Mrs. Blackwell asked. "Oh yes," Drummond confirmed with a nasty smile. "She said she'd come into a substantial inheritance, but there were complications that required her stepdaughter to be, and I quote, permanently absent from Montana. She offered me a cut if I'd take the girl far enough away that she'd never find her way back." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Cartwright gavelled for silence, his expression thunderous. Jacob Hawkins was called next, and he entered, the witness stand looking like a man going to his execution. His testimony was brief but powerful. He confirmed the timeline of events, admitted that Eleanor had insisted Martha be removed from the house by a specific date, and acknowledged that he'd been too weak to protect his own daughter from his wife's schemes. "Did you know about the inheritance?" Mrs. Blackwell asked. "No," Jacob said firmly. "I swear I knew nothing about it. If I had known Eleanor was stealing from Martha, I'd have—" His voice broke. "I'd like to think I would have stopped her, but given my track record of failing my daughter, perhaps I wouldn't have. I'll have to live with that uncertainty for the rest of my life." Finally, Penelope took the stand. She was visibly nervous, her hands shaking as she was sworn in, but her voice was clear when she began to speak. "I heard my mother talking about the inheritance," Penelope testified. "It was about 8 months ago. She'd received a letter and was reading it in her room. I came in to ask her something, and she was so excited she showed me the letter. It said that my step-grandmother in Boston had died and left a large estate to Martha as her only heir." "What was your mother's reaction to this news?" Mrs. Blackwell asked. Penelope's voice trembled. She said it was unfair, that Martha didn't deserve that kind of money, that she'd figure out a way to claim it for herself since she'd raised Martha and paid for her upkeep all those years. "I didn't think much of it at the time." Mother often complained about Martha, but then, over the next few months, she became obsessed with getting Martha out of the house. She kept saying we needed to make arrangements before it was too late, that Martha needed to be gone by early autumn at the latest. "Did she ever explain why the timing was so important?" "Not explicitly, but I overheard her telling someone, I think it was Mr. Guthrie, that the inheritance transfer would be finalized within 6 months, and she needed to make sure there were no complications. No witnesses who could contradict her story." Eleanor stood abruptly, her control finally breaking. "You ungrateful little traitor," she shrieked at her daughter. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me, by lying in court." Judge Cartwright's gavel came down hard. "Mrs. Hawkins, you will control yourself, or you will be removed from this courtroom. Sit down and be quiet." Eleanor sat, but her face was twisted with rage. Penelope, in contrast, looked oddly peaceful, as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders by speaking the truth. Mrs. Blackwell had one final question. "Miss Hawkins, why are you testifying against your mother today?" Penelope looked directly at Eleanor. "Because what she did was wrong. Because Martha deserves justice. And because I'm tired of being the kind of person who stays silent when evil happens right in front of her. I want to be better than that, better than I've been," the testimony concluded, and Mrs. Blackwell rested her case. The evidence was overwhelming, the witness statements consistent and damning. Martha felt cautiously optimistic as Mr. Pemberton rose to present Eleanor's defense. But what defense could possibly explain away the documented fraud, the multiple witness testimonies, the clear timeline of deception? As Mr. Pemberton began to speak, attempting to paint Eleanor as a misunderstood stepmother who'd made difficult decisions for complicated reasons. Even he seemed to know it was a losing battle. The truth was out, documented and witnessed and undeniable. Now it was up to Judge Cartwright to decide what justice looked like. Mr. Pemberton's defense of Eleanor was brief and unconvincing. He attempted to argue that the forged death certificate had been a clerical error, that Eleanor had genuinely believed Martha had died during one of her illnesses. But when Mrs. Blackwell pointed out that the certificate was dated 2 weeks before Martha's attempted sale to Drummond, when Martha was demonstrably alive and well, the argument collapsed. He tried to paint Martha as a vengeful stepdaughter, exaggerating normal family tensions, but the documentary evidence of fraud was incontrovertible. He suggested that the inheritance rightfully belonged to Eleanor as the one who'd raised Martha after Caroline's death. But Montana law was clear. Inheritance passed through bloodlines, and Eleanor had no legal claim to Caroline's family estate. Finally, desperately, Mr. Pemberton called Eleanor herself to the stand. It was a mistake, and Martha suspected Mrs. Blackwell knew it the moment Eleanor was sworn in. Her stepmother's face was tight with barely controlled fury, and when she began to speak, her voice dripped with contempt. "I did what I had to do," Eleanor said coldly. "I took in that girl when her father married me. I fed her, clothed her, kept a roof over her head for 14 years. That inheritance from her grandmother, money, I never even knew existed until that letter arrived. It should have gone to me as compensation for raising someone else's child. But the law doesn't see it that way," Mrs. Blackwell said mildly. "The law says the inheritance belongs to Caroline's descendants, to Martha. Didn't you know that when you forged the death certificate?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "I knew what the law said. I just didn't think it was fair. Why should she get $50,000 for doing nothing, while I got nothing after years of putting up with her presence in my home?" The courtroom went absolutely silent. Eleanor had just confessed openly and without apparent remorse to committing fraud because she felt entitled to money that wasn't legally hers. Mrs. Blackwell pressed her advantage. "So you're admitting you knew the inheritance belonged to Martha, but you forged documents claiming she was dead so you could steal it?" "I'm saying I claimed what should have been mine by right," Eleanor snapped. "If the law had any sense—" "The law is what it is," Mrs. Blackwell interrupted. "And you violated it. You forged legal documents, made false statements to defraud an estate, and attempted to dispose of your stepdaughter to prevent her from contradicting your lies. Is that not correct?" Eleanor's attorney was frantically signaling her to stop talking, but she was beyond listening. "Everything I did because that ungrateful girl was a burden and an embarrassment. She had no prospects, no future, nothing to offer anyone. At least with Drummond she'd have had a purpose, and I would have had the money to give Penelope the life she deserved. The wedding she wanted, the wedding that's now postponed indefinitely because of the scandal you created," Mrs. Blackwell noted. "That's her fault." Eleanor pointed at Martha with a trembling finger. "If she'd just stayed gone, none of this would have happened. But no, she had to come back, had to stir up trouble, had to ruin everything." Judge Cartwright's gavel came down hard. "That's enough, Mrs. Hawkins. You may step down." Eleanor descended from the witness stand, her face flushed and her eyes wild. She just destroyed any remaining credibility she might have had, confirming everything Martha and the other witnesses had testified to. Mr. Pemberton looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. After a brief recess, Judge Cartwright called the courtroom back to order. His expression was grave as he surveyed the assembled parties. "I've heard testimony and reviewed evidence in this matter," he began, his voice carrying clear authority. "The facts are not in dispute. Indeed, Mrs. Hawkins herself has confirmed the essential elements of the fraud. She received notification of an inheritance that legally belonged to her stepdaughter. Rather than informing Martha Hawkins, now Mrs. Stone, of this inheritance, she forged a death certificate and made false claims to the estate administrators in Boston in order to steal money that was not hers. He paused, letting his words sink in. This court finds that Eleanor Hawkins committed fraud, forgery, and attempted to deprive Martha Stone of her rightful inheritance through deliberate deception. The transfer of funds to Mrs. Hawkins is hereby declared void. The inheritance, all $50,000 plus any interest accrued, shall be transferred to its rightful owner, Mrs. Martha Stone. Martha felt Caleb's hand grip hers tightly. They'd won. The judge had ruled in their favor, but Judge Cartwright wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for consideration of criminal charges against Eleanor Hawkins. Fraud of this magnitude cannot be treated as merely a civil matter. The law must have teeth or it means nothing, Eleanor gasped, her face going white. Criminal charges could mean prison time, public disgrace, near complete social ruin. Additionally, the judge continued, Mrs. Hawkins is ordered to pay all court costs and legal fees associated with this case, as well as punitive damages in the amount of $5,000 to Mrs. Stone for the pain and suffering caused by this fraudulent scheme. He looked directly at Eleanor, his expression cold. You stood in this courtroom today and admitted without remorse to deliberately stealing from your stepdaughter. You showed no contrition, only entitlement and anger at being caught. This court has seen many cases of greed and deception, but rarely has it encountered someone so utterly convinced of their right to take what belongs to another. Your behavior has been reprehensible, and the consequences will be severe. Eleanor stood, trembling with rage. This is an outrage. You can't— I can and I have, Judge Cartwright said firmly. The ruling stands. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in noise, some people cheering, others gasping, everyone talking at once. Martha sat frozen, trying to process what had just happened. She'd won. Not just the money, though, that was substantial and life-changing. She'd won the public acknowledgement of Eleanor's cruelty, the validation of her own suffering, the recognition that what had been done to her was wrong. Caleb pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his chest, overcome with emotion. Mrs. Blackwell was beaming, shaking hands with various supporters who'd attended the hearing. Mr. Garrett pushed through the crowd to embrace Martha, tears streaming down his weathered face. Justice, he said simply. Finally justice. Penelope approached hesitantly, her own face tear-stained. I'm so glad, she said to Martha. So glad you won. You deserved this. Martha reached out and pulled her stepsister into an embrace. Thank you for testifying. That took real courage. It was the least I could do, Penelope whispered. I'm just sorry it took me so long to find that courage. Eleanor was surrounded by her attorney and several officials, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. As Martha watched, Eleanor's eyes found hers across the crowded courtroom. The look was pure hatred, venomous and unrepentant. But Martha felt no fear, no residual pain. Eleanor had lost, thoroughly and publicly, and no amount of hatred could change that fact. Jacob Hawkins stood alone near the back of the courtroom, looking lost and old. Martha caught his eye and saw the question there. Was there any path forward for them, any possibility of reconciliation? She gave him a small, sad smile and a slight shake of her head. Some bridges once burned couldn't be rebuilt. But she hoped he'd find peace somehow, hoped he'd learn from his failures, even if it was too late to repair the damage he'd caused. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun was brilliant on the snow. Martha stood on the steps with Caleb, breathing in the cold, clean air, feeling lighter than she had in months. How do you feel? Caleb asked. Free, Martha said simply. Like I've finally closed a door on the past and can fully commit to the future. Ruth Anderson appeared with her husband Jack, both offering hearty congratulations. Other neighbors and townspeople approached, some apologizing for not seeing Eleanor's cruelty sooner, others simply expressing happiness at the outcome. Martha accepted it all with grace, no longer needing their approval, but appreciating their kindness nonetheless. As the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Blackwell approached with final paperwork. The inheritance transfer will take a few weeks to complete, she explained, but the judge's order is clear and binding. The money is yours, Mrs. Stone, all of it, plus interest and the punitive damages. You should receive approximately $58,000 once everything is finalized. The number was staggering. More money than Martha could have imagined having, enough to transform their lives in countless ways. But as she looked at Caleb, at his steady, loving presence, she knew the real treasure wasn't the money. It was the life they'd built together, the love they shared, the future stretching before them full of possibility. What will you do with it? Mrs. Blackwell asked curiously. Martha considered. Some of it will go to practical things, improving our homestead, securing our future, maybe helping Penelope get a fresh start somewhere if she wants one. Some will go to charity. I want to establish a fund to help other women in difficult situations, women who need a way out like I did. And some we'll save for our children's education when they come. She smiled up at Caleb, but mostly we'll use it to build a life that would have made my mother proud. That's what she would have wanted. For her family's money to create something good in the world. As they prepared to leave, one final figure approached, an elderly woman Martha didn't recognize at first. She introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, the church organist who'd always complimented Martha's singing. I just wanted to say, Mrs. Patterson began, her voice quavering with emotion, that I'm sorry I never did more to help you when you were suffering. I saw what Eleanor was doing and I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, but that was cowardice. You deserved better from all of us. Martha took the old woman's hands gently. You gave me what you could. Those kind words about my singing meant more than you know. They were little lights in some very dark days. I don't hold any grudges, Mrs. Patterson. I'm just glad the truth finally came out. The old woman nodded, tears flowing freely now. You're a remarkable young woman, Martha Stone. Your mother would be so proud of the person you've become. Those words, more than anything else that day, made Martha's own tears finally fall. She'd spent so many years wondering if she'd disappointed her mother's memory, if Caroline would be ashamed of how passive and accepting she'd become. But now, standing here having fought for what was right, having reclaimed her dignity and her inheritance, she finally felt worthy of her mother's love. The ride back to the cabin was quiet but peaceful. The winter landscape stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and serene. Martha felt Caleb's solid warmth behind her on the horse, his arms around her waist, and thought about how far she'd come from that terrible day when she'd been sold like property. Back then, she'd believed her life was ending. She'd thought she had no value, no future, no hope. But that terrible day had led her here, to love, to justice, to a future brighter than anything she'd allowed herself to imagine. Sometimes, she reflected, the worst moments in life were doorways to the best ones. You just had to have the courage to walk through. When they reached the cabin, Caleb dismounted and lifted Martha down. But instead of releasing her, he held her close, his forehead resting against hers. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. The way you handled everything today, the testimony, the confrontation, even the victory. You never gloated, never let the anger consume you. You stayed true to who you are, kind, strong, graceful. That's the woman I married, and I fall more in love with her every day. Martha kissed him softly. I couldn't have done any of it without you. You gave me the safety and love I needed to find my strength again. You reminded me that I had worth, that I deserved to be treated with dignity. Everything good in my life now traces back to that day you walked into my father's house and saw me, really saw me, when no one else would. They went inside together, and Martha looked around their home with fresh eyes. This cabin, which had seemed so humble when she first arrived, now felt like a palace. It was filled with love and respect and partnership, things more valuable than any inheritance. That night they sat together by the fire, making plans for their future. They'd expand the cabin, add that extra bedroom they'd talked about. They'd invest in the homestead, perhaps buy more land, build a small herd of cattle. They'd set aside money for their future children's education and opportunities. And yes, Martha would establish that fund for women in need, a legacy that would help others escape situations like the one she'd endured. She'd call it the Caroline Hawkins Memorial Fund, honoring her mother by doing the work her mother would have done if she'd lived, helping women find their strength and their freedom. "Do you think Eleanor will go to prison?" Martha asked as they prepared for bed. "Probably," Caleb said. "The judge was clear about referring it for criminal prosecution, and the evidence is overwhelming. She'll likely face several years behind bars." "I should feel happy about that," Martha said. "But instead I just feel tired. Tired of thinking about her, tired of carrying any emotion related to her at all." "Then stop thinking about her," Caleb suggested gently. "She's not part of your life anymore, Martha. She can't hurt you. She has no power over you. Let her fade into your past where she belongs." It was good advice, and Martha intended to take it. Eleanor Hawkins had stolen enough of her life. She wouldn't get another moment of Martha's time or energy. As Martha lay in bed that night, Caleb's arms around her, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain, the humiliation, the years of being made to feel worthless, all of it had led here. To this cabin in the mountains, to this man who loved her, to this life she'd built from the ashes of the old one. She thought about her mother's inheritance and what it represented. Caroline's family had built that wealth through hard work and sacrifice, and they'd passed it down as a gift to future generations. Eleanor had tried to pervert that gift, to steal it for her own selfish purposes. But the inheritance had found its way home to the rightful owner, and Martha would use it the way it was meant to be used, to build something good, something lasting, something that honored the people who'd come before. The money would make their lives easier, certainly. They'd never have to worry about bad harvests or harsh winters threatening their survival. They could provide well for their children, give them opportunities Martha had never had. But the real treasure was already here, in the love they shared, in the respect they showed each other, in the partnership they'd built together. Money could buy security and comfort, but it couldn't buy what Martha had found in Caleb's cabin. It couldn't buy the peace of being truly seen and valued. It couldn't buy the joy of waking up each morning next to someone who thought you were perfect, exactly as you were. Martha drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face, her hand resting over her heart where her mother's locket lay against her skin. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but she'd face them with Caleb beside her and the knowledge that she was finally, truly free. The past was behind her. The future stretched ahead, bright and full of promise. And Martha Stone, formerly Martha Hawkins, formerly the unwanted stepdaughter who'd been sold like property, was ready to claim every bit of happiness that future held. Spring came to the mountains with a rush of melting snow and birdsong. 3 months had passed since the hearing, and the inheritance had been fully transferred to Martha's name. True to her word, she'd put the money to practical use, expanding the cabin, investing in their homestead, and establishing the Caroline Hawkins Memorial Fund with a substantial endowment. The fund had already helped 3 women escape difficult situations, providing them with enough money to start fresh in new towns with new opportunities. Each time Martha signed a check to help another woman, she felt her mother's presence, felt the rightness of using Caroline's legacy this way. The cabin expansion was nearly complete. They'd added 2 bedrooms, one for the children they hoped for and one for guests. There was also a proper study where Martha kept the books for both the homestead and the memorial fund. She'd discovered she had her mother's head for numbers and had taken on the role of managing their finances with confidence and skill. Caleb had been right about her not being too old to pursue her dreams. She'd started teaching herself more advanced mathematics from books ordered from back east, and she'd begun tutoring some of the neighbors' children in reading and arithmetic. It turned out she had a gift for teaching, for making complex ideas accessible. She was building the life she'd once only imagined, one small step at a time. On a warm April morning, Martha stood in the expanded garden plot, planning where to put the various vegetables and herbs she'd ordered. The soil was rich and dark, ready for planting. Caleb was in the barn, building shelves for storage. his steady hammering a comforting background rhythm. She heard a horse approaching and looked up to see Ruth Anderson riding toward the cabin, waving cheerfully. Martha smiled and went to greet her friend, glad for the company. "I brought news," Ruth said as she dismounted, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "And a gift." "Well, more of a loan, really." She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a package wrapped in cloth. Martha unwrapped it carefully to find a beautiful leather-bound Bible, its cover embossed with intricate designs. "It's gorgeous," Martha breathed. "But Ruth, this is too valuable." "It's not a gift, not exactly," Ruth interrupted. "It's something Caleb ordered months ago, before the hearing even. He asked me to hold on to it until the right moment. He said he wanted you to have a family Bible, one where you could record your marriage and eventually your children's births and build a new family history, a legacy separate from everything that came before." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. Of course, Caleb would think of something like this, a tangible symbol of their new beginning, a place to record the family they were building together. "He's a keeper, that man of yours," Ruth said warmly. "And now for the news. I heard from Mr. Garrett that Eleanor Hawkins was sentenced yesterday. 2 years in the territorial prison for fraud and forgery. Penelope's left Cedar Ridge entirely, moved to Oregon to stay with an aunt. Your father's living alone in that big house, apparently quite miserable." Martha absorbed this information with mixed feelings. She'd known criminal charges were coming, but hearing the actual sentence made it real. 2 years was a long time, though perhaps not long enough for the magnitude of what Eleanor had done. "How do you feel about it?" Ruth asked gently. "Relieved, I think," Martha said honestly, "knowing she's facing real consequences, that the law took her actions seriously, but also free. Like that chapter of my life is finally truly closed. I don't have to wonder anymore if she'll face justice. She has, and now I can let it all go. And your father?" Martha shook her head. "I feel sorry for him in a way. He made his choices, and now he's living with the consequences. But I can't be the one to absolve him or comfort him. That's not my responsibility anymore." They walked back toward the cabin together, and Martha showed Ruth the garden plans, the expanded rooms, the study where she worked on her teaching materials and fund administration. Ruth marveled at the transformation. "You've built something really special here," she said. "A home, a purpose, a life that matters. I'm so proud of you, Martha." After Ruth left, Martha took the family Bible inside and showed it to Caleb. His weathered face softened when he saw her tears. "You remembered," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Of course I remembered," Caleb replied. "I told you I wanted to build a real life with you, a real family. This is part of that, recording our story, making it official in a way that goes beyond legal documents." They sat together at the kitchen table, and Caleb showed Martha what he'd already written on the first page in his careful, neat handwriting. Caleb Stone, born 1846, Pennsylvania. Married Martha Hawkins, October 15th, 1882, Montana Territory. This is our family's story, to be passed down to our children and their children. May they know that we built this life on love, respect, and the belief that every person has inherent worth and dignity. Martha read the words through her tears, then took the pen and added her own entry. Martha Hawkins Stone, born 1854, Montana Territory, daughter of Jacob and Caroline Hawkins, grateful beyond measure for second chances, for love that sees clearly, and for the courage to claim the life I deserve. They added more details, their wedding date, the names of their witnesses, even a note about Rosie the mare who'd carried Martha to her new life. It was a beginning, the first pages of a book that would hopefully grow thick with births and marriages and milestones over the years to come. A few weeks later, Martha made one final trip to Cedar Ridge. She had business to attend to, finalizing some paperwork for the memorial fund, meeting with the lawyer about establishing a scholarship program, and one other task she'd been putting off. She found her father sitting alone on the porch of the house that had once been her home. He looked older, thinner, diminished by grief and regret. When he saw her approaching, he stood uncertainly, as though not sure whether to greet her or flee. "Hello, Papa," Martha said quietly. "Martha," his voice cracked on her name. "I didn't expect. I thought you'd never want to see me again. I don't, particularly, Martha said honestly. But I realized I had some things I needed to say, and I wanted to say them to your face rather than carrying them around with me. She gestured to the porch chairs, and they sat, the space between them feeling like miles. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Martha began. I forgive you, she said. I told you that before, but I don't think you believed me. I do forgive you for failing to protect me, for choosing the easy path over the right one, for standing by while Eleanor tried to destroy me. I forgive you not because you deserve it, but because holding on to that anger was poisoning me. I'm letting it go. Jacob's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. I don't deserve— No, you don't, Martha interrupted firmly. But forgiveness isn't about what people deserve. It's about what I need to move forward with my life. And I need to release this weight I've been carrying. She paused, then continued. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean I'm inviting you back into my life or pretending the past didn't happen. You made your choices, and those choices have consequences. I have a new family now, a husband who values me, friends who support me, a life I've built from nothing. You're not part of that life, and you never will be. I understand, Jacob said, his voice barely a whisper. But I want you to know I am sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. Not a day goes by that I don't regret my weakness, my failure to be the father you needed. I believe you, Martha said. And I hope you find peace with your regrets, Papa. I hope you learn from them and become a better person. But that's your journey to make, not mine to guide or witness. She stood to leave, then turned back one final time. Mama would have protected me. She would have chosen me over social standing, over money, over everything. I know that with absolute certainty. And that knowledge, that I was loved like that once, even if I lost it too soon, that's helped me survive everything that came after. So thank you for marrying her, at least. Thank you for those few good years when I knew what it felt like to be truly loved by a parent. She left him there on the porch, tears streaming down his face, and didn't look back. There was a finality to it, a closing of a door that needed to be closed. She felt lighter as she walked away, as though she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying for far too long. That evening, back at the cabin, Martha told Caleb about the conversation. They sat in their respective rocking chairs on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, and she described the bittersweet relief of finally saying goodbye to her father. Do you think you'll regret it? Caleb asked. Cutting ties completely? No, Martha said with certainty. Some relationships can't be repaired, and that's all right. I have everything I need right here. A husband who loves me, a home I've helped build, work that matters, and a future full of possibility. That's more than enough. Caleb reached over and took her hand. I have some news, he said, a hint of excitement in his voice. I've been talking with Jack Anderson and some of the other neighbors. We're thinking of starting a cooperative, pooling resources to buy equipment, sharing labor during harvest, maybe eventually building a small school so the children don't have to travel so far for education. That sounds wonderful, Martha said warmly. And if you need a teacher for that school when it's built, I know someone who'd be very interested in the position. I was counting on it, Caleb replied with a smile. You've got a gift for teaching, Martha. The Anderson children talk about you like you're the wisest person they've ever met. They sat in comfortable silence, rocking gently, hands clasped. The mountains stood eternal around them, witness to their small human joys and sorrows. An eagle soared overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. I'm happy, Martha said suddenly, as though the realization surprised her. Truly deeply happy in a way I never thought I'd be. Is that strange? To still be amazed by happiness after all these months? Not strange at all, Caleb assured her. When you've gone without something for a long time, it feels miraculous when you finally have it. I still wake up some mornings surprised to find you beside me, grateful that this isn't a dream. Me too, Martha admitted. Sometimes I can't believe this is my life, that I get to wake up in this beautiful place, with a partner who respects me, doing work that matters. It feels too good to be real. It's real, Caleb said firmly. And you earned every bit of it. You survived years of cruelty with your kindness intact. You fought for justice when it would have been easier to walk away. You built a life based on your values rather than others' expectations. That kind of courage and integrity deserves happiness, Martha. Never doubt that. As summer approached, Martha discovered she was pregnant. The joy was overwhelming, tempered only slightly by natural nervousness about childbirth and motherhood. But Ruth assured her that women had been having babies in these mountains for generations. And Dr. Harrison from the next county was available if needed. Martha recorded the expected birth in the family Bible, their first child due in late autumn. She ran her fingers over the words, imagining a little one joining their family, filling the cabin with new sounds and energy. Boy or girl, doesn't matter to me, Caleb said when she told him. Healthy is all I care about. Healthy baby, healthy wife. Everything else is just details. They prepared the nursery together, Caleb building a beautiful cradle from pine he'd carefully selected and cured. Martha sewed tiny clothes and blankets, each stitch a prayer for the child to come. The Andersons threw a small celebration, and neighbors brought gifts and advice. Martha felt embraced by a community in a way she'd never experienced in Cedar Ridge. As her belly grew and the baby began to move, Martha would sometimes sit in her rocking chair, hands on her stomach, talking to the child about the world they'd be entering. She told them about their grandmother Caroline, whose legacy had helped build this life. She told them about their father, the mountain man with the gentle heart and steady hands. She told them they were already loved, already wanted, already valued beyond measure. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Martha turned to Caleb with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if Eleanor hadn't tried to sell me? She asked. If none of that had happened? Sometimes, Caleb admitted, though I try not to dwell on it. Why? Because in a strange way I'm almost grateful it happened, Martha said slowly. Not for the cruelty itself, but for where it led me. If Eleanor had been kind, or even just indifferent, I might have stayed in that house forever, slowly disappearing, never knowing what I was capable of. I might never have found you, never have discovered my own strength, never have built this life. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us crack us open in ways that let the light in. Eleanor tried to break me, tried to erase me. Instead, she freed me. She forced me out of that house and into a life where I could finally become who I was meant to be. That's a generous way of looking at it, Caleb said. Maybe, Martha agreed, but it's true nonetheless. I wouldn't wish what I went through on anyone, and I'm using the memorial fund to help other women avoid similar fates. But for myself, personally, I can look back now and see that every hard thing I survived made me stronger, taught me something, prepared me for this life I'm living now. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move. And this child, our child, will grow up knowing their worth. They'll never wonder if they're loved or valued. They'll see their parents treating each other with respect and kindness. They'll learn that dignity is inherent, not something that can be given or taken away by others' opinions. That's the legacy we're building, Caleb. That's what really matters. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Martha went into labor. Ruth and Dr. Harrison were there, providing calm guidance through the long hours. Caleb waited outside, pacing and praying, until finally he heard the sound he'd been waiting for, a baby's first cry. Strong and healthy, Ruth emerged with tears of joy streaming down her face. "You have a daughter," she announced. A beautiful, perfect daughter. And Martha's doing fine, tired but fine. Caleb was allowed in to meet his child, and what he saw took his breath away. Martha, exhausted but radiant, held a tiny bundle wrapped in the quilt Sarah had made all those years ago. The baby had dark hair and grey eyes that would probably change color, and a cry that suggested she'd inherited her mother's determination. "She's perfect," Caleb whispered, touching one tiny fist with his calloused finger. The baby gripped his finger instinctively, and he felt his heart expand in ways he'd forgotten were possible. "What should we name her?" Martha asked. They'd discussed names for months, but had never quite decided. Now holding their daughter, the name came to Martha with sudden clarity. Hope, she said. We should name her Hope Caroline Stone. Hope for the future we're building, and Caroline to honor my mother's legacy. Hope Caroline Stone, Caleb repeated, testing the sound of it.
It's perfect.
She's perfect. You're perfect. He leaned down to kiss Martha gently. Thank you for this gift. Thank you for choosing this life with me. Thank you for being brave enough to build something beautiful out of all that pain. Martha looked down at her daughter, at Hope, whose very existence was a testament to second chances and new beginnings, and felt a completeness she'd never known was possible. This was what her mother's inheritance had truly given her, not just money, but the foundation for a life built on love and dignity and mutual respect. The story that had begun with her being sold like property had led her here, to this moment, to this family, to this overwhelming sense of rightness and belonging. Eleanor had tried to write Martha out of existence, but instead she'd pushed her toward a life richer and more meaningful than anything Cedar Ridge could have offered. As Martha looked at her husband and daughter, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the hard times that had taught her strength, for the kind people who'd helped along the way, for the courage to claim what was rightfully hers, and most of all, for this mountain man who'd looked at her and seen not a burden, but a treasure. You're perfect for me, Caleb had said that first day, and he'd been right. They were perfect for each other, two wounded souls who'd found healing in partnership, two underestimated people who'd built something extraordinary together. The mountains stood watch as they always had, indifferent but majestic, while the small human drama of love and redemption played out in the cabin below. And in that cabin, Martha Stone held her daughter close, surrounded by love, knowing with absolute certainty that she was finally, truly home.